She gave him everything. He threw her away in the rain, 6 months pregnant with his children. 15 years later, his sons came to collect. If you've ever watched someone you loved look straight through you like you were nothing, keep watching. This story goes places that will wreck you. Drop a like and comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The night Bianca Romano's life ended, the chandeliers were still burning. There were 300 of them. Guests, she'd called them, though half were predators in tuxedos, and the other half were wives who'd learned long ago to keep their eyes low and their opinions lower. They filled the De Lorenzo ballroom the way expensive furniture fills a room that nobody actually lives in. Gorgeous, cold, arranged. Bianca stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown the color of champagne silk, one hand resting lightly on the banister, the other pressed flat against the curve of her belly. 6 months. 6 months of carrying 3 lives inside her body, 3 heartbeats she'd listened to on a monitor 2 weeks ago while Luca sat in the corner of the obstetrician's office, checking his phone. She hadn't said anything about that then. She'd learned not to say anything about a lot of things, but tonight was different. Tonight was their 8th anniversary, and the mansion smelled of gardenias and roasted duck and something smoky underneath all of it that she couldn't quite name. She'd overseen every detail herself, the centerpieces, the menu, the seating chart arranged so carefully to avoid the particular landmines of Mafia politics. She'd spent 2 weeks on it. She hadn't slept properly in 4 days. She looked beautiful. She knew that because Marco, their head of security, had told her so at the foot of the stairs with the kind of awkward sincerity that only genuinely decent men manage to produce. She'd thanked him, smoothed the silk over her stomach, and climbed. Luca was already downstairs. She could see him through the gilded archway at the base of the stairs. Broad shoulders in a black tuxedo, hair silver at the temples now in a way that made him look like money, which was the point, which had always been the point with Luca De Lorenzo. He was laughing at something. That particular laugh, the one he deployed at parties, generous and booming, designed to fill the room. She knew every version of Luca's laugh. She'd cataloged them over 8 years the way a cartographer marks coastlines. This one meant he was performing. He was talking to a woman in red. Bianca's hand tightened on the banister. She didn't know the woman, or she told herself that, for the 3 seconds it took her to descend 2 more steps and get a cleaner angle on the face. Then she knew. She'd seen that face in the background of photographs she wasn't supposed to find. In a text thread she'd glimpsed once over Luca's shoulder before he tilted the phone away with the casual ease of a man who'd been managing information his whole life. A woman with dark hair cut close to a jaw that was all angles, eyes that caught light like something engineered to catch light. Vanessa Cross. Bianca kept walking down the stairs. Her face did the thing it had learned to do at these events. Settled into something warm and unreadable. A diplomat's expression. The expression of a woman who has hosted 100 of these nights and survived every one of them. Her heels found each step. Her chin stayed level. Somewhere in the ballroom, a string quartet shifted into something slow. She reached the bottom of the stairs. A woman named Elena Ferrara, wife of one of Luca's lieutenants, a small, restless woman who'd always been kind to Bianca in a slightly desperate way, caught her arm immediately. "You look incredible," she said. "Truly. How are you feeling?" "Good," Bianca said. "The boys are active tonight." "Boys? All 3? "All 3. Elena pressed a hand to her heart with the theatrical delight that was her particular talent. 3 boys. Luca must be— "Excuse me," Bianca said, and she wasn't sure why, only that she needed to move, needed to cross the 30 feet of marble floor between herself and her husband before something inside her chest finished the sentence. It had been trying to start for the past 3 minutes. She moved through the crowd. People touched her arm, said her name, kissed her cheek. She registered all of it on the surface and none of it underneath. Her eyes were on Luca. He saw her coming. That was the part she would replay afterward, in the weeks and months that followed when she was alone and the boys were asleep, and the silence in whatever rented room she was living in pressed in close. He saw her coming. His eyes found her across the crowd, and something passed over his face. Not guilt, not exactly, something more calculated than guilt. Something that looked almost like relief, like he'd been waiting for this moment, like he'd chosen it. He took Vanessa's arm, not in a discreet, I need to handle this way. He took her arm the way a man takes the arm of a woman he is displaying, deliberately, publicly. He turned them both so they were facing the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he said. He had a voice that could quiet a room without trying. 300 people heard the shift in register and turned. The string quartet faded out. Bianca stopped walking. She was maybe 20 feet from him, close enough to see his cufflinks, the gold ones she'd bought him for their 5th anniversary, and close enough to see that Vanessa Cross had a small smile arranged on her face like something she'd practiced in a mirror. Thank you all for being here tonight, Luca said. I asked you to come together to celebrate. I want to be honest with you about what exactly we're celebrating. Bianca's hand found her stomach without her telling it to. For 8 years, I've maintained a situation in this house that hasn't been fair, not to myself and not to the woman standing beside me now. He didn't look at Bianca when he said it. He looked at Vanessa. Vanessa Cross has been in my life for 2.5 years. She is the woman I should have been building toward. I know that now. I wanted the people who matter most to me to know it too. The ballroom had gone the kind of quiet that has texture to it. Someone's champagne flute clicked against a plate somewhere in the back. Bianca couldn't feel her legs. She could feel her son's. One of them was moving, a slow roll against her ribs that she'd learned to identify as Kyle, always the restless one, even in the womb. But her legs had gone to something that wasn't quite numb and wasn't quite pain. Bianca. Luca looked at her now. His face was composed. His voice was measured. He'd rehearsed this, she understood suddenly. He'd rehearsed every word. You've been good to this house. But I won't insult you by pretending this marriage is something it stopped being a long time ago. The children... He paused, and for one terrible second she thought he was going to say something humane, something that would make this comprehensible, would complicate things, considerably. They're your sons, she said. She hadn't planned to say anything. The words came out quiet, steadier than she felt. They'd be obligations, he said, at a time when I can't carry that kind of weight. You understand? She looked at him. She looked at the man who had proposed to her on a rooftop in Milan with a ring that had been his grandmother's, who had held her through a miscarriage she'd never talked about publicly, who had kissed her temple in their kitchen at 7 a.m. when he thought no one was watching. She looked at him and she understood. Not what he was saying, but what she was looking at. She was looking at the truth of him, the version that had always been there, the version she'd spent 8 years choosing not to see clearly. I'll have the house manager arrange transport, he said. Tonight. That was when one of his men, she didn't know his name, a young one with a narrow face, appeared at her elbow with her coat draped over one arm. Not her coat from the cloakroom, her coat from upstairs. From her own closet. Someone had been sent upstairs while the party was going on. Someone had been sent to start packing her out. She took the coat. She didn't put it on. She held it against her chest and she walked back through the crowd because the crowd was the only way out and she was not going to run. She would not give them a run. She heard things as she moved, the particular silence of people pretending not to have seen what they'd just seen. One woman's indrawn breath, somebody's chair scraping back. A man whose voice she recognized as Carlo Morano saying something low and sharp to the person beside him, in a tone that suggested he, at least, had the decency to be appalled. Marco was at the front door. He'd gotten there before her. He opened it, and he didn't say anything, which was the right choice, the only right choice. And she would remember that about him later. The night hit her face. November, close to winter, the kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your jaw. She made it down the front steps, and then she made it to the middle of the driveway, and then the rain started. Not gradually, not the way rain usually starts in movies, but all at once, like a switch thrown, drenching her champagne-colored gown in seconds. She stood in it. She could hear music starting again behind her. She could see the lights of the ballroom through the tall windows, the shapes of people resuming, the great machine of an expensive party reasserting itself because Luca de Lorenzo's parties did not stop for something as inconvenient as the expulsion of his pregnant wife. She put her hand on her stomach. All 3 of them were moving now, that restless internal tidal motion she felt in the evenings, the one her doctor called normal and that she called company. She said nothing out loud. What she said in the sealed interior of herself, in the place that Luca had never actually accessed, no matter how many years she'd spent in his house. She said it to her sons, who were not born yet and had no idea what had just happened and were in there in the dark, in the warmth, alive and intact, and completely untouched by any of this. She said, "I'm going to need you to be strong." Then she put on her coat over the soaked gown and she walked to the gate. She had $40 in her coat pocket. She'd put it there out of habit. She always kept cash. One of the small survival instincts she'd developed in 8 years of living adjacent to the kind of wealth that is actually a form of captivity. And a phone with 11% battery and the names of 3 people in the city she believed she could actually call. She called none of them that night. She called a car service, gave them an address across town, a small hotel she'd stayed in once years ago before Luca. Before all of it, back when she was 23 and in New York for a fashion industry trade show, and the world was still mostly open. She paid with the $40. She sat in the back of the car with her coat plastered to her body and the heat vent blowing dry air at her face, and she did not cry. She looked out the window at the rain-blurred city moving past, and she thought about silk. Specifically, she thought about embroidery. She'd started embroidering when she was 9, in her grandmother's kitchen in Palermo. Not the elegant kind, the working kind. The kind that takes 6 hours for a 3-inch section and leaves your fingertips ridged and calloused. Her grandmother had said, "If you can do this, you can do anything. Because this is the thing nobody can take from you. They can take your house, they can take your name, they can take everything a man thinks he can take, but they cannot take what you know how to make." She checked into the hotel. She showered. She sat on the edge of the bed in one of the hotel's white robes, and she opened the notepad on the desk, the kind with the hotel logo at the top, cheap paper, short pencil, and she wrote 3 names, Kyle, Orion, Cassian. She didn't know yet which was which. She'd been debating names for 2 months, running them past Luca, who'd shown the kind of vague interest a man shows when he's already decided something and is waiting for the right moment to reveal it. She knew now he'd already decided. He'd been waiting for this party the same way a man waits for a verdict he's already arranged. She looked at the 3 names. She wrote one word under them. Everything. She slept 4 hours. When she woke up, the sun was coming through the gap in the curtains, and her body was already doing the thing it did in the mornings now. The low pull across her lower back, the tightness, the sense of internal pressure that her doctor kept saying was completely normal for a triplet pregnancy at this stage. She ate the granola bar she found at the bottom of her coat pocket. She drank 2 glasses of water from the bathroom tap. Then she picked up the hotel phone because her cell was dead, and she called the one name she hadn't let herself call the night before. Her cousin Alma, who lived in Brooklyn in an apartment above a dry cleaner and who had hated Luca De Lorenzo from the first handshake and had never once pretended otherwise. Alma picked up on the second ring. It was 7 in the morning. "It's me," Bianca said. A pause. "I know it's you. Talk." He threw me out. "I know. Elena Ferrara called 3 people who all called me. Where are you?" She told her. "Stay there," Alma said. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't eat the minibar stuff. It's highway robbery." Bianca almost laughed. "Alma." "What?" "Bring thread." Another pause, different this time, softer. "What kind?" "Anything. Whatever you have. I need something to do with my hands." Alma arrived in 35 minutes with a bag of groceries, 2 skeins of silk thread, 1 gold, 1 deep burgundy, and the expression of a woman who has been furious on someone's behalf for so long it has become a permanent feature of her face. She hugged Bianca carefully around the stomach, and then she sat across from her at the small hotel table, and she said, "Tell me all of it." Bianca told her. Alma listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, without any of the theatrical horror that the story probably deserved. When Bianca finished, Alma was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" she said. "I need to work," Bianca said. "I need a space, somewhere I can set up. Not here, somewhere permanent or close enough to permanent. I have some money, not much. I have skills. I need to figure out how to make them worth something. You've been making that man's household look like it belonged in a magazine for 8 years." "I know." Your embroidery work is what I have, Bianca said. It's what I actually have. The rest of it, the house, the name, the accounts, I don't know what I have access to yet. I need a lawyer. She pressed her hand to her stomach, one of her sons pushing back against the pressure. I need to do this right. No running, no hiding, right. Alma looked at her for a long time. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay? Finish the coffee. Then we plan. They spent the morning doing exactly that. By noon, Bianca had a list that covered both sides of 3 hotel notepad pages. An appointment with a family lawyer Alma knew, a woman named Patricia Hess who took domestic cases with the focused aggression of someone settling a personal score. A lead on a studio sublet in Red Hook, small, cheap, north-facing light, the kind of light that embroiderers and painters and desperate people with something to prove always look for. 3 names of boutique buyers who'd expressed interest in handmade luxury textiles at an industry event Bianca had attended the previous spring, when she'd still been Bianca De Lorenzo, wife of, hostess of, arm of, and had slipped the buyers her personal card because some part of her had always known, or at least suspected. She did not allow herself to feel what she felt. She felt it anyway, in the seams of everything, in the moments between one action and the next. Grief, which was not the word she wanted, but was the word that kept presenting itself. Grief for the version of the future she had believed in. Grief for the woman who'd stood at the top of that staircase an hour before everything detonated and thought, "This is my home." Grief for the specific loneliness of discovering that a life you built carefully was, from another angle, a room you'd been locked in. She didn't let it stop her hands. The thread Alma had brought was silk, fine gauge, the gold a shade she'd have called antique rather than bright. She threaded it while they talked, and she worked a small piece of linen from Alma's bag. A pillowcase, actually, practical, slightly worn. And she worked a pattern she'd been carrying in her head for weeks, a series of interlocking geometric forms that expanded outward from a center point. She worked it without looking down much. Her hands remembered what her mind was too occupied to consciously access. By the time Patricia Hess's office opened the following Monday, Bianca had produced 17 inches of embroidered linen and a legal strategy she'd developed in collaboration with Alma at the kitchen table of the Brooklyn apartment where she was now sleeping on the pull-out sofa. Patricia Hess looked at the case notes, looked at Bianca across the desk, and said, "He's made some mistakes. Tell me. The prenuptial is tight, but not airtight. There are marital assets he's structured under corporate umbrellas that were likely established during the marriage. Depending on how those were capitalized, you may have a claim. But this takes time. How much time? Years, potentially. I have 3 sons coming in approximately 12 weeks, Bianca said. I can't afford years right now. What can I have now? Patricia Hess wrote a number on a pad and slid it across the desk. This is what I can get you in emergency interim support based on your pregnancy status and the circumstances of your removal from the marital home. It won't sustain you at the level you're accustomed to. Good, Bianca said. I'm not trying to sustain the level I'm accustomed to. I'm trying to build something different. Patricia Hess studied her. Most women in your position want security first. I want my sons to grow up in something I built, Bianca said, not something I extracted from a man who threw me away. The lawyer nodded, once, with the clipped respect of someone recalibrating their assessment. Then let's get started. The boys came early. 31 weeks, which was not a catastrophe, but was not a celebration either. Bianca had been in the Red Hook studio, a narrow second-floor space that smelled of turpentine from the previous tenant and had a radiator that clanked all night. When the contractions started, sharp and unmistakable, nothing like the Braxton Hicks she'd been navigating for weeks. She called Alma, who arrived in 8 minutes and drove with the focused efficiency of someone who trained for this without being told. The hospital was 14 minutes away. It felt like an hour. They were born in the early morning, 3 hours after she arrived. Kyle first, then Cassian, then Orion, who spent 22 days in the NICU after being born at 3 pounds 1 ounce, and who terrified her in a way she didn't have language for, a biological terror that bypassed thought and went straight to the basemost part of her, the animal part that is not capable of strategy. She sat beside his incubator on the second night after the nurses had done their rounds and the ward had gotten quiet, and she talked to him. She told him about the studio. She told him about the 17 inches of linen. She told him about the buyers she was going to call as soon as she was physically able to leave this hospital. She told him that she needed him to get bigger and stronger and more difficult because she had plans that required all three of them, and she was not going to renegotiate. He gained 4 ounces in the next 3 days. The nurses said it was the feeding schedule. Bianca chose to believe it was the conversation. She brought them home to the studio. There was a back room she'd partitioned with a curtain, a heavy velvet thing she'd found at a second-hand market in Borum Hill, deep green, the kind of color that feels like shelter. And she set up the 3 second-hand bassinets that Alma and 2 of Alma's friends had assembled while Bianca was in the hospital. The studio smelled of velvet and radiator heat and the faint chemical ghost of the previous tenant. She stood in the doorway of that back room with 3 sleeping newborns, and the present she was holding them in felt both impossible and very, very specific. She went to her work table. She had an order, her first real order, placed by a boutique buyer named Simone Park, who ran a small luxury accessories shop in the West Village, and who had called Bianca on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks before the boys came, after receiving the hand-embroidered sample scarf Bianca had sent her in lieu of a formal portfolio. "I need 12 of these," Simone had said. "Can you do 12 by January?" It was October. Bianca was 31 weeks pregnant with triplets and sleeping on a pull-out sofa and had $1,200 in her personal account after legal fees. "Yes," she'd said. She made 12. She made them while the boys slept in their bassinets behind the velvet curtain, and while Alma came and went, and while the radiator clanked and the Red Hook street noise filtered up through the floor. She made them in the gaps between feedings, between the 2 a.m. and the 5 a.m. and the 7 a.m., her hands working in the small circle of lamplight that was the only light she kept on, because light cost money and she was keeping a list. Simone Park paid her. Then Simone Park told someone. Then that someone, a woman who ran a much larger operation, a boutique chain with locations in 4 cities, called Bianca in February and said she'd heard there was a textile artist in Red Hook doing handmade luxury embroidery work, and she wanted to see a portfolio, and did Bianca have one? "Give me 2 weeks," Bianca said. She built the portfolio in 2 weeks. She stayed up past midnight every night the boys would let her, which was not often, but she did it anyway. She photographed everything on a white sheet she'd bought at a discount shop and hung over the studio wall. She wrote copy for the photos herself, precise and without flourish, describing technique and material and time investment in the cool language of someone who'd spent 8 years watching luxury goods be marketed to people with money and had absorbed, without meaning to, the particular grammar of that world. The chain buyer said yes. By the time Kyle, Cassian, and Orion were 6 months old, Bianca had 4 commercial clients and a waiting list. By the time they were a year, she had incorporated under the name Romano Couture. Alma had argued for something more aggressive, something that sounded like an opening salvo in a war. But Bianca had said no. She wanted her name, her actual name, the name she'd been born with before she'd ever heard of Luca De Lorenzo, and had hired 2 assistants who worked out of the studio in shifts around the boys' schedule, which was the kind of logistical challenge that would have seemed impossible a year earlier and was now simply Tuesday. Luca, across the city, knew none of this. Or he knew it in the peripheral, distracted way that men know things about women they've discarded. Which is to say, he received occasional information and filed it under irrelevant. His men reported, because his men reported everything, that his ex-wife was doing some kind of needlework business out of Brooklyn. He reportedly laughed. The man who'd laughed at his own anniversary gala while his pregnant wife stood 20 feet away in the ballroom light, with her hand on her stomach, found this particular information funny, which told Bianca, when it eventually reached her through channels she'd developed, everything she needed to know about what she was dealing with. She kept working. The boys grew. They grew with an intensity that caught her off guard, which was absurd given that she'd been the one monitoring every week of their existence. But watching 3 humans go from the impossible fragility of early infancy to something vocal and opinionated and chaotic and individual was a kind of vertigo she hadn't been prepared for. Kyle was relentless. the one who pulled himself to standing before the others, who screamed the longest when frustrated, who could be distracted by fabric, by color, by the texture of things, who would sit in the studio and run his small fingers over the embroidery samples, with an attention that seemed, even at 14 months, like something more than sensory curiosity. Cassian was the observer. He watched everything, responded slowly, rarely cried, and when he did, it was with the focused purpose of someone who'd calculated it would be effective. Orion, who'd fought so hard to get to a size that didn't terrify neonatologists, became the one who laughed the most. Big, unpredictable laughter that exploded out of him at irregular intervals, usually at something only he found funny. She told them about their father. Not yet in language they could understand, but she talked in the studio while she worked, narrated what she was doing and why, included in those narrations the outline of the larger project, the reason they were here in this studio in Red Hook rather than in a mansion in Westchester. She didn't catastrophize it. She didn't perform the wound for them. She simply included it, the way you include a fact about the geography of a place when you're explaining where you live. Their father had made a choice, she told them. He'd chosen wrong. That was his problem, and she wasn't going to make it theirs. What she was going to do was build something, and they were going to grow up inside it, and when they were old enough to understand what it was and what it had cost, they could decide for themselves what they thought of that. Kael, at 18 months, chewed the edge of a fabric swatch and looked at her with dark eyes that were, with a precision she found unsettling, exactly the color of Luca's. She kept working. The call from Celeste Valenti came in the third year. By then, Romano Couture had outgrown the Red Hook studio and moved to a proper commercial space in Greenpoint, ground floor, a former textile factory, pressed tin ceilings, the kind of space that functions as its own kind of argument about what you're doing. By then, Bianca had 8 employees and a client list that had expanded beyond boutiques to include 2 runway commissions for emerging designers who wanted handcrafted embellishment work that couldn't be replicated by a machine. By then, she'd slept more than she had in the first 2 years, which is a low bar but felt like extraordinary progress. Celeste Valenti called on a Wednesday morning and asked for a meeting. Bianca didn't know the name. She looked it up afterward, in the car on the way to the address Celeste had texted. A building on the Upper East Side, Old Moneystone, the kind of address that doesn't need to announce itself. What she found in the brief search was the profile of a woman who existed largely outside the layers of publicity that surrounded the kind of wealth she apparently had. A few business journal mentions, a charitable foundation that supported arts education, a biography that described her as a private investor with holdings in fashion, real estate, and finance. She did not find, because it was not in any public record, the fact that Celeste Valenti had been born Celeste De Lorenzo and that her son was Luca. The apartment was 4 floors of the building, entered through a private elevator that required a key. Celeste met her in a sitting room that was full of art and light and a specific kind of elegant severity that felt earned rather than constructed. She was in her late 60s, a compact woman with white hair cut short and the kind of posture that suggests someone who's been in physical pain for long enough that correcting against it is now automatic. She shook Bianca's hand and said, "Thank you for coming. I've been following your work for about 2 years." "Why?" Bianca said. Celeste's mouth moved in the direction of a smile. "Because I know quality when I see it, and because I owed you a debt I'm only now in a position to address properly." She gestured to a chair. "Sit down. I'm going to tell you something about myself that isn't in any public record, and then I'm going to make you an offer. You can leave at any point. I'll understand." Bianca sat. Her hands, habit, and training went still in her lap. Celeste told her. She told her about Luca, her son, the child she'd raised after his father died, the boy who'd grown into something she'd tried to account for and couldn't. She told her about learning the affair, not from gossip, but from documents. Luca, in some act of hubris she still couldn't entirely account for, had restructured some holdings in a way that required her signature as a dormant co-investor. And in the process, she'd seen enough of his financial life to understand that the affair had been going on for 3 years before the gala, and that Luca had been deliberately planning the exit from his marriage to Bianca as part of a larger consolidation of his assets into forms that would be harder to claim in any settlement. The public humiliation had been strategic. The rain, the coat already packed, all of it staged for an audience of witnesses who could, if ever challenged, testify that Bianca had left of her own accord. Celeste had cut off contact with her son the week after the gala. She'd been watching Romano Couture since year one. "I want to invest," she said. "Substantially. Not as a silent partner. I have opinions, which I'll share and which you can reject. I have relationships in European fashion markets that you don't have access to yet and that would accelerate your timeline by years. And I have—" She paused, her hands flat on her knees. "A certain investment in seeing my son understand the specific scope of what he threw away." Bianca was quiet for a moment. "You're his mother," she said. "I am." "Does he know you're doing this?" "No, and I'd like to keep it that way for now. Not because I'm running a strategy against him, though what I'm proposing would eventually serve that purpose, but because my relationship with my son is something I've decided to treat as finished. His reaction to my choices is his problem." Bianca looked at her. She looked at this woman who had the same direct quality in the eyes that Luca had, the same quality she'd once found compelling and had learned over 8 years, was the particular directness of people who have decided what they want and arrange the world accordingly. In Luca, it had become something predatory. In this woman, it seemed to be pointed at something else. "I need to think about it," Bianca said. "Of course. I'll come back to you in 1 week." "Take 2, Celeste said. "Bring questions. I prefer people who arrive with questions." Bianca spent the 2 weeks doing the one thing that always sorted her thinking. She worked. She produced 40 inches of a new piece, a large-scale embroidered panel she'd been commissioned for by a hotel group in Milan that wanted something for their lobby. She worked it in the evenings after the boys were asleep, the 3 of them now in beds in the small apartment above the Greenpoint studio where she'd moved them 6 months earlier, close enough to work to hear the boys if they called out, far enough from the street noise that they slept through most of it. She thought about Celeste's offer. She thought about the word debt, which Celeste had used once and not repeated. She thought about what it would mean to take money from Luca's mother, to build something with the support of a woman who carried his name genetically, if not legally. She thought about her sons. She thought about what she was building and for whom. On the 14th day, she called Celeste and said, "Yes, with conditions." "Name them," Celeste said. "I retain full creative and operational control. Your investment is financial and advisory. If we disagree on direction, my decision is final." "Agreed." "The boys don't know who you are." "Not yet. When and if I tell them is my call." A pause. "That's fair," Celeste said. "It's what I would want, too." "And one more thing," Bianca said. "Whatever personal interest you have in outcomes related to your son, I understand it and I don't begrudge it. But I won't be making decisions in service of it. I'm building something for my sons. If what I build happens to be a reckoning for their father, that's a side effect, not the plan." Celeste's voice, when she answered, had a quality that wasn't quite emotion and wasn't quite its absence. "I understand," she said. "I wouldn't want anything else." They signed papers 2 weeks later. Romano Couture's expansion into European markets began the following spring. It was not fast, and it was not smooth, and there were months where Bianca questioned every decision she'd made since that night in the rain, months where the numbers were terrifying and the boys were demanding, and Alma called on a Tuesday evening to find Bianca sitting on the studio floor surrounded by fabric samples and said, "Talk." "I don't know what I'm doing," Bianca said. "Yes, you do," Alma said. "I'm 36 years old with 3 4-year-olds and a business that's either going to make me or make you," Alma said. "Obviously, you've been doing this since before you knew you were doing this. Stop." "Stop what?" "Stop sitting on the floor. Get up and show me what's wrong with the numbers." She got up. The numbers weren't wrong. They were tight in the way that expanding businesses are tight, the kind of tight that requires holding your nerve rather than changing course. She held it. Celeste's European contacts proved to be exactly what she'd said they were, and within 18 months, Romano Couture had distribution relationships in Paris, Milan, and London. Within 3 years, it had its first standalone retail presence, a small, severe shop on a side street in the Marais that Bianca designed herself. The interior stripped back to stone walls and brass fixtures and a single large embroidered panel behind the main display case that had taken her 4 months to produce and that a French fashion journalist, in the first major profile Romano Couture received, described as the most significant piece of textile art to emerge in the past decade. Luca De Lorenzo, who'd been photographed at a Paris Fashion Week party that same season with Vanessa Cross on his arm, and a suit that cost what Bianca had paid for her first studio, apparently saw the profile. One of Bianca's Paris-based staff mentioned it in a weekly update, that a man matching De Lorenzo's description had been seen outside the Marais shop, standing on the sidewalk looking at the window, not going in. Bianca read that line twice. Then she wrote her response to the rest of the weekly update and did not address it. He hadn't been inside. He'd stood on the sidewalk. She thought about that, about what it meant to stand outside something you'd thrown away and not go in. Then she thought about her boys, Kael at 5, already obsessed with the way fabric moved and fell, touching every textile in the studio with the focused reverence of someone encountering a language they were just beginning to understand. Cassian at 5 already negotiating with her over everything, not out of manipulation, but out of what seemed like a genuine need to understand the logic of each decision. Orion at 5 already the one who made the other two laugh, who diffused the tensions that came up between three boys, sharing a small space with the instinctive social intelligence of someone who understood, even then, that the room itself is a system, and you can choose how to be in it. She looked at her sons. She looked at what she was building. She looked at the number she'd written on a hotel notepad 3 years ago, under 3 names. Everything. And in the city across the ocean, Luca De Lorenzo stood on a Paris sidewalk looking at something his wife had made and didn't go in, which meant he was still trying to decide whether she was real. She was going to show him. She just needed more time. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that one of her closest international partners had been talking to someone they shouldn't have been talking to, had been feeding information through a chain that ended after 3 careful steps at a man in a collapsing mafia empire who'd spent the last decade watching his fortune shrink and his criminal infrastructure crack, and who had recently, quietly, started looking for ways to use what he'd abandoned to salvage what he'd kept. The phone call that would change everything came on a morning in October, 14 years after the rain, from a source inside her own operation. And when Bianca picked it up and heard what was being said, her hand went still on the fabric she'd been working, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of anger that had been waiting underneath everything all along. Not hot, not explosive, but cold and precise and completely ready. Good, she thought. Now we finish it. The source's name was Daniel Reeves. He'd been with Romano Couture for 6 years, head of international logistics, the man responsible for coordinating production schedules between the Greenpoint Atelier and the 3 European workshops Bianca had contracted over the past decade. He was 41, efficient, mildly reserved in the way that people who work with numbers tend to be, and Bianca had trusted him with the kind of operational detail that, if it ended up in the wrong hands, could do real damage. It had ended up in the wrong hands. The source who called Bianca that October morning was Mira Solis, her Paris operations manager, a sharp, self-contained woman who'd come to Romano Couture from a French luxury house 4 years earlier, and who had, without being asked, developed the habit of noticing things that weren't her formal responsibility. What Mira had noticed over the past 6 weeks was a pattern in Daniel's communication with an external consultant the company had never formally retained, a man named Patrick Voss, whose name appeared in Daniel's email archives, which Mira had accessed, technically outside her authority, because something had felt wrong, and Mira Solis had learned to trust that feeling. He's been sending production forecasts, Mira said, her English carrying the faint cadence of French syntax, especially when she was tense. Quarterly projections, client acquisition data, the Milan contract terms. Bianca was standing at her work table in the Greenpoint Atelier. It was 7:40 in the morning. The boys had left for school 40 minutes earlier. Kael always last, Cassian always first, Orion always standing in the doorway claiming he was ready while clearly not being ready. The atelier was empty except for her. "How far back?" she said. 8 months that I can confirm, possibly longer. And Voss. I ran him. He has no legitimate consulting practice. He has a registered address in New Jersey and 3 corporate entities that don't appear to have any operational history. A pause. One of the entities has a listed director. The director's name is Carlo Morano. Bianca set down the length of silk she'd been holding. Carlo Morano. She knew that name the way you know the names of people who were present at specific disasters. Not intimately, but precisely. He'd been at the gala. He'd been the one she'd heard say something sharp and low to the person beside him as she walked out. He was also, or had been, one of Luca's 3 senior lieutenants. "Send me what you have," Bianca said. "Everything." "Already sent. Encrypted folder. The key is the date of your Paris opening." "Mira," Bianca pressed her hand flat to the table. "Does Daniel know you've seen this?" "No." "Keep it that way. Come to New York." "When?" "Thursday." She hung up. She stood in the empty atelier for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The long work tables, the organized ranks of thread on the wall rack, the half-finished panel pinned to the standing frame in the corner. Then she picked up her phone again and called Orion. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he was probably between classes. He was 14, and in his first year at the specialized mathematics program he'd tested into, and he treated his schedule with the precision of someone who'd decided efficiency was a form of respect. "Mom, are you between classes?" "For 11 minutes. I need you to look at something tonight. Financial documents. I need your eyes on the structure." A pause. Not surprise. Orion didn't do surprise the way other people did. He went quiet instead, and in the quiet you could almost hear him recalibrating. "How bad?" "I don't know yet." "Okay, I'll eat dinner first." She almost said something lighter, something to soften the weight of asking a 14-year-old to analyze corporate espionage documentation. Instead, she said, "Good. Eat." She called Cassian next. He was in his school's debate practice. She could hear the background noise, voices overlapping, the acoustics of a gymnasium or a large classroom. He stepped out to answer. "What's wrong?" "Why do you assume something's wrong?" "Because you never call during school hours unless it's wrong." His voice was flat in the way that meant he was controlling something. "Tell me." "Tonight. Come home directly after practice." "Mom, Cassian." A breath. "Okay." Kale, she didn't call. Kyle was in his design studio class, took in. He'd arranged his schedule around it the way Orion arranged his around math. And calling him mid-session would produce nothing useful because Kyle's relationship with interruption was, to put it generously, adversarial. She texted him instead, "Dinner at home. Important." He replied 4 minutes later with a single question mark, which was his version of acknowledged. She spent the rest of the morning going through Mira's files. What she found was worse and cleaner than she'd hoped. Worse because the breach was genuine and substantial. 8 months of granular operational data, the kind of information that could, in the right hands, give a competitor or an enemy a detailed map of Romano Couture's capacity, client relationships, and growth strategy. Cleaner. Because Daniel had been careless in the way that people who believe they're untouchable are careless, which meant the documentation trail was intact and comprehensive. She thought about Carlo Morano. She thought about what a former Mafia lieutenant does when the empire he served starts cracking. She thought about Luca standing on a Paris sidewalk 2 years ago, looking at a window he hadn't walked through. She thought about the word salvage. Luca was trying to use her business to prop up whatever remained of his criminal infrastructure. Not directly. He was too smart for direct. But the information about Romano Couture's client list, its financial projections, its European distribution network, that was useful to someone trying to reestablish credibility and leverage in a world that had been watching his legitimate holdings erode. He was going to use what she'd built to rebuild what he'd wasted. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She read through it a second time, slower, with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with anger. The kind that is actually the opposite of anger, cold and methodical and looking for the exact shape of a thing so that you know precisely where to cut. The boys arrived home in their usual staggered formation, Cassian at 5:15, Kyle at 5:40, Orion at 6 carrying a textbook he was still reading when he came through the door. Bianca had made dinner, which she did when things were serious, because the act of feeding them was one of the few forms of control she trusted completely. She'd made the pasta that Cassian had loved since he was 6. Simple, a little garlic, the good olive oil. And she'd set the table properly, not the usual clear the end of the work table arrangement, but the actual table in the kitchen, plates and everything. Cassian looked at the table and then at her. "That bad," he said. "Eat first," she said. They ate. Kale talked about a draping technique he'd been working on, a problem with how a particular weight of wool behaved over a structured shoulder, and the way he talked about it, hands moving, slightly too loud for the kitchen, settled something in the room, normalized the space enough that by the time Bianca cleared the plates and sat back down, the tension had been metabolized into something they could work with. She laid it out. All of it. Daniel, Voss, Murano. The 8 months of data. The chain she believed led back to Luca. She watched their faces. Cassian's went still in the way it went still when he was processing rapidly. Surface calm, but his jaw was tight, and he was looking at a point approximately 2 inches in front of the table rather than at anything in the room. Kyle's went somewhere harder, a flash of something raw before he controlled it. Orion had picked up the pencil he'd been turning in his fingers throughout dinner and stopped turning it. 8 months, Orion said, at minimum. How much of the Milan projection did he have? Full document. Margin breakdown included. Orion set the pencil down. That's why the Corsetti group undercut us on the Liguria Hotel commission. Bianca looked at him. In March, he said. They came in at a number that didn't make sense given their production costs. I pulled their last 2 public commissions trying to figure out how they were doing it. They weren't. Their margins couldn't support that bid, which meant they had information about our floor, and they came in under it. He said it without particular heat, the way he delivered most things. But his eyes, when he looked up at her, had something in them that was not at all neutral. I should have pushed harder on that. You didn't know, she said. I should have pushed harder, he said again, which was not agreement, just the second statement of a position he was going to hold until he'd worked out what to do with it. Kael said, Who else at the company knows? Mira, now us. And Daniel doesn't know we know. Not yet. Kael leaned back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the look that meant he was moving things around in his head, arranging a space the way he arranged fabric, trying configurations until one felt structurally correct. Okay, he said. So we have a window. Yes. Before he realizes the leak's been found, we can decide what to give him. Cassian looked up from the 2 inches in front of the table. What do you mean, give him? If the leak is still open, it's an asset, Kael said. We can decide what information moves through it. Cassian's expression shifted in the specific way it shifted when he was about to take apart an argument. That assumes we want to run a counter-operation through an employee we'd have to keep in place without tipping him. I know what it assumes. It also assumes the other end of the line is still interested in receiving information, which, Cassian, Kael's voice had an edge now. I'm not disagreeing. I'm stress testing it, Cassian said. That's different. Bianca let them run. She'd watched them do this for years. The friction between Kael's instinct toward decisive action and Cassian's compulsion to examine the structure of every decision before committing to it. It was not a comfortable dynamic, but it was a useful one, and the ideas that came out the other side of it were almost always better than what either of them had started with. Orion said, without looking up from whatever he was calculating in his head, The question is what we're trying to accomplish. Both his brothers stopped. If we want to protect the company, he said, we close the leak, terminate Daniel, and document everything for legal use. That's clean. That's the right call for the business. He finally looked up. If we want to use this, he paused, choosing the word more completely, then we need to think about what Murano and whoever's behind him are actually looking for, and whether there's something more valuable we can put in front of them than quarterly projections. The kitchen was quiet. How long would it take you to put together a false financial picture? Bianca said. Orion considered it. Something convincing? A week? Something that would survive scrutiny from someone with genuine financial expertise. 2 weeks. Build it, she said. I want to see it before we decide whether to use it. And Daniel, Cassian said, Daniel stays in place until I say otherwise. He doesn't know we know. He does his job exactly as he's been doing it. She looked at Cassian. I need you to handle his next logistics meeting. Find a reason to sit in. I want to know how he presents. Cassian nodded. Kael. She looked at her eldest. The Milan contract renewal is in 6 weeks. I want the creative proposal to look larger than it is. New lines, expanded scope, numbers that suggest we're entering a growth phase we haven't entered yet. Kael was already nodding before she finished. You want them to think we're overextended. I want them to think we're an acquisition opportunity. Kael stared at her. Then he laughed, short and sharp and genuine. That's evil, he said, with a quality in his voice that was unmistakably admiration. It's strategy, she said. Same thing, he said. Mira arrived from Paris on Thursday. Bianca met her at the atelier, just the two of them, and they spent 4 hours going through every document in the encrypted folder. Mira was precise and economical in how she spoke. She didn't editorialize, she presented, and when she had an opinion, she labeled it as one, which Bianca had always found clarifying. He flagged the Celeste Valenti investment early on, Mira said at one point. She pulled up a specific email chain. 6 months into his arrangement with Voss, he spent significant time on it. Bianca looked at the screen. The email was Daniel's, addressed to Voss, and it described Celeste's involvement in Romano Couture with the clinical accuracy of someone who'd done real research. It described her as a substantial silent investor. It described the investment timeline. It noted specifically that Celeste Valenti had no known public business relationship with Luca De Lorenzo. He found her, Bianca said. He found her name. I don't think he found the connection. Bianca read the email a second time. The connection, the fact that Celeste was Luca's estranged mother, was not in any document, not in any filing, not anywhere outside the conversation in Celeste's Upper East Side apartment 11 years ago, and the years of working relationship that had followed. It was one of the very few things that existed only in people's memories. But Daniel had flagged Celeste's name, which meant he'd handed it to Voss, which meant whoever was at the end of that chain had Celeste Valenti's name and had presumably done their own research. Bianca called Celeste that evening. The phone rang 4 times, which was unusual. Celeste answered on the 5th. I was expecting this call, she said. You know, I found out yesterday a contact of mine flagged some unusual inquiries about my investment history. A pause. Someone's been asking about me in connection with Romano Couture. I need to know if they've found the family connection. A silence. Not long, but waited. I don't know, Celeste said. If they have, I'm not aware of it yet. If they have, Bianca said carefully, then Luca knows you're involved, and he knows why. Yes. Would that change anything for him? It would infuriate him, Celeste said, with the precise flatness of someone who knows exactly what they're describing. He would feel... She stopped. He would feel that I'd made a choice against him, which I did, years ago. But seeing it materially in the form of a financial investment in his ex-wife's company, that's different from absence. That's an act. Good, Bianca said. Celeste was quiet. That's how I intended it 11 years ago, Bianca said. I just didn't know you were his mother when I agreed to it. Once I did, I understood it was the same thing. You never said that. I know. A longer silence. Bianca, Celeste said, what are you building toward? I'm building toward the same thing I've been building toward for 14 years. And my son is going to see all of it, she said, at a moment of my choosing, not his. She could hear Celeste breathing, could hear, in that breath, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent years grieving something that hadn't died, just changed into a shape she couldn't love. The birthday, Celeste said. Bianca said nothing. I've been thinking about the birthday, Celeste said. 70 years. It's the kind of thing that requires a significant gesture, a gathering. Yes, Bianca said. It is. At the house? It's your house, Bianca said. It's always been your house. He moved in after his father died. You let him use it. That was your generosity, not his inheritance. That's technically accurate, Celeste said slowly, but I've never... It's your house, Bianca said again, and you can invite whoever you choose. The silence stretched. Outside the atelier window, the street was doing what Brooklyn streets do at 8 in the evening. A delivery truck, voices, the metal sound of a gate being pulled across a storefront. Ordinary, grinding, real. I'll send the invitations in December, Celeste said. The party would be in the spring, May. That gives us 7 months. Is that enough? Bianca thought about Orion's 2-week timeline for the false financial picture. She thought about the Milan contract renewal. She thought about the legal documentation Patricia Hess had been slowly building for a decade. A quiet architectural project that existed in physical files and encrypted drives and in Patricia's meticulous mind, around the corporate structures Luca had built during the marriage. The ones that had used marital assets and that contained, buried in their foundational documents, the legal exposure that Luca had apparently never believed would be found or pursued. It's enough, she said. She was on her way back from Celeste's building. She'd gone up after the call, sat with the older woman for an hour in the severe sitting room with its art and its light, because there are things that should be said in person, when her phone rang. The number was Cassian's. The logistics meeting, he said, without preamble. I was in it. And? Daniel ran it normally, completely normal. Professional, detailed, nothing unusual. A beat. But at the end, when the team was leaving, he stayed behind to help me with a question about the shipping manifest. Routine. And his phone was on the table, face down, and it vibrated twice, and he picked it up very naturally, looked at the screen very briefly, and then put it back face down. Did you see the screen? No, but I saw his face after. Another beat. Mom. He knows. She stopped walking. She was on the sidewalk outside Celeste's building, the autumn cold working at her neck above her coat collar. A cab moved past. Someone's dog pulled at a leash somewhere behind her. How confident, she said. Confident, Cassian said. He wasn't scared. He was recalculating. There's a difference. There was a difference, and Cassian had always known it. Had always been the one who read the room's emotional architecture with the precision of someone who'd been doing it since before he had language for it. She trusted the read. Then we have less time than we thought, she said. Orion can accelerate the financial documents. Tell him 48 hours. He won't like that. He'll do it. A pause. She could hear Cassian breathing. Then, there's something else. Tell me. In the meeting, a question came up about the Valenti investment. Routine, a reconciliation question about the quarterly report. And Daniel answered it. He paused again. He didn't hesitate. He knew the structure of the investment, the percentages, the entry point, in more detail than his role requires. She stood very still. He's specifically been tracking Celeste, Cassian said, not just the company. Her. And there it was. The specific shape of the thing, the exact edge she'd been looking for when she'd read through the documents twice that morning with the cold attention that was the opposite of anger. They weren't just mining Romano Couture for competitive intelligence. They'd found Celeste. They'd figured out that the woman bankrolling Bianca Romano's empire was someone with a personal stake in Luca de Lorenzo's undoing. And if they'd figured that out, they were already pulling on that thread. Is Celeste in danger? Cassian said. Not physically, Bianca said. Her money, her reputation, her privacy, those are what's at risk. She started walking again. Cassian, I need you to call Patricia Hess first thing tomorrow. Tell her we're moving to the next phase. A pause. Does Patricia know what the next phase is? She's been building it for 10 years, Bianca said. She knows exactly what it is. After she hung up, she walked the rest of the way to the subway and stood on the platform in the particular desolate beauty of a New York subway platform late on a Thursday evening. The tile, the track noise building from somewhere dark and distant, the few other people each occupied completely by their own private urgency. and she thought about a number. Not the number on the hotel notepad. A different number, one Patricia Hess had given her 3 months ago in their most recent meeting, sitting across the desk in that office with its controlled clutter and its aggressive orderliness. The estimated current valuation of the legitimate corporate entities that existed within Luca De Lorenzo's financial structure. The businesses built on marital assets, the ones the legal case addressed. The number was significant. Luca had apparently spent the last 14 years being aggressively incompetent with his criminal empire, while being somewhat less incompetent with the legitimate businesses he'd built as cover, which meant there was something left worth taking. Not enough to save him. The criminal infrastructure was already gone, already mostly seized or collapsed or abandoned, but enough to constitute, in the right legal context, a reckoning of genuine material weight. The train came. She got on. She stood holding the overhead bar, and she thought about May, about a birthday party at a mansion that had once expelled her in the rain, about 3 sons who were going to walk into that ballroom as something their father had never imagined them being, and about the man who would be standing there when they did. She thought about what Cassian had said. He was recalculating. So was she. The difference was that her calculation was 14 years old and had been refined every single day since. She got off at her stop. She walked the 4 blocks to the Atelier building. She unlocked the door, went up the stairs, and found Orion sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop and 3 handwritten pages of figures spread in front of him. His hair the specific disaster it became when he'd been working with focus for more than 2 hours. He looked up when she came in. 48 hours, she said before he could speak. He looked at her. Cassian called, she said. He looked back at the laptop. His jaw set in the way it set when he was absorbing something he didn't like. I can do it in 36, he said. The structure's already there. I just need to populate it with numbers that tell a specific story. What story? He turned one of the handwritten pages toward her. A company that's overextended on its European expansion. Strong brand, genuine revenue, but thin liquidity due to aggressive capital deployment. The kind of picture that makes a cash-rich buyer think they could come in at a favorable valuation and consolidate. He tapped the page. If someone's looking for a way to attach themselves to Romano Couture, to use our legitimacy to shore up their own position, this is the picture that invites that conversation. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the story they told. The elegant fiction of a company slightly too far ahead of its own resources, the kind of vulnerability that looked like opportunity to the right kind of predator. And the real numbers, she said, stay exactly where they are, he said, locked. The false version goes to Daniel through a document he'd have normal reason to access. I'm building it inside a reconciliation file he's already authorized to review. He'll send it, she said. Within 24 hours of seeing it, Orion said. She stood there in the kitchen with her coat still on and her son with his disaster hair looking at her with those eyes that were, as they had always been, the most unsettling combination of her own steadiness and something else. Something she'd decided years ago came from inside him and nowhere else. The third one born, the one who'd fought his way to 4 pounds in an NICU while she sat beside the incubator and told him about Silk. Orion, she said. I know, he said, which was not quite an answer but was exactly right. She took off her coat. She sat at the table across from him. Show me the structure, she said. He turned the laptop toward her. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in whatever remained of the life Luca De Lorenzo had built with Vanessa Cross and arrogance and other people's money, a phone was about to ring with information that would convince him he had found the opening he'd been looking for. He had. He just didn't know yet what was waiting for him on the other side of it. Orion delivered the false financial package in 31 hours. He sent it to Bianca at 4 a.m. with a single line of text. It's clean. Anyone who knows what they're looking at will believe it. She read it at 6, standing in the Atelier kitchen in the gray pre-dawn with her first coffee, and she went through the document page by page with the slow attention of someone looking for the seam where fiction meets reality. She couldn't find it. The numbers cohered. The story they told, Romano Couture overextended, thin on liquidity, primed for acquisition, was plausible in the specific way that only true things and very carefully constructed lies manage to be. She sent it back with one word. Good. By noon it was inside Daniel Reeves's reconciliation file, embedded in a quarterly document he had scheduled access to review on Fridays. It was Tuesday. That gave them 3 days before he'd have normal reason to open it, but Bianca had watched enough of how Daniel operated to know he checked his files daily, the way compulsive people check compulsive things, and the document would be flagged as updated. He'd open it within 24 hours. She was right. Mira called from Paris at 7 that evening. He accessed the reconciliation file at 4:15, Mira said. He spent 22 minutes in the document. He forwarded an extracted summary to Voss at 4:40. 25 minutes from reading to forwarding. Daniel Reeves was not a cautious man, or he was a cautious man who had stopped being cautious because he believed after 8 months of clean transmissions that he was operating in a space no one was watching. Good, Bianca said. Now we wait. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, because the thing about a trap is that it changes the air pressure in the room in ways you can feel but not always identify in time, was that they were not the only ones who'd been constructing a false picture. The call came 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She was in the atelier with Kyle, who'd come in early to work on the creative proposal for the Milan renewal, and they were in the middle of a disagreement about scale. Kyle wanted to expand the proposal to include an architectural textile installation, something large-scale and permanent, and Bianca thought the timing was wrong given what they were running with Daniel, too much visibility at the wrong moment. And the phone rang and she looked at the number and something in her, the part that has been managing risk for 14 years, said pick it up. She stepped away from the table. Bianca Romano, she said. Ms. Romano. A male voice, controlled, older. My name is Frank Caruso. I'm an attorney. I represent a client who has asked me to reach out to you directly, and I want to be very clear from the beginning that this call is a professional courtesy, not a negotiation. She was quiet. My client has become aware of certain activities within your company that may have legal implications for Romano Couture's financial disclosures, Caruso said. Specifically, my client has documentation suggesting that a significant portion of Romano Couture's capital structure involves funds with origins that would not survive regulatory scrutiny. The atelier was quiet except for Kyle moving fabric behind her and the street noise from outside. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, which she noted and set aside. I'm listening, she said. My client's position is not adversarial, Caruso said, with the practiced smoothness of someone who says adversarial things in non-adversarial tones for a living. He simply wants to open a conversation about a potential business arrangement that would be mutually beneficial given the current complexity of the situation. Who is your client? She said. A pause. I'm not authorized to disclose that at this stage. Then we don't have a conversation, she said. If your client wants to talk to me, your client calls me, not through an attorney who isn't authorized to tell me who he represents. Ms. Romano. Goodbye, Mr. Caruso, she said, and she hung up. She stood with the phone in her hand. She stood very still. Kyle had stopped moving. She could feel him watching her from across the atelier without turning to look. Mom. Give me a minute, she said. She called Patricia Hess. Saturday, mid-morning. Patricia answered, which said something about Patricia. I just received a call from an attorney named Frank Caruso, Bianca said. He claimed to represent a client with documentation suggesting Romano Couture's capital structure involves funds of questionable origin. He framed it as a courtesy call and mentioned a potential business arrangement. Patricia was quiet for 4 seconds. Say that last part again. Funds with origins that would not survive regulatory scrutiny. Another 4 seconds. That's not a fishing expedition, Patricia said. That's a specific claim. Either they have something or they're claiming to have something. Which is worse? Depends on what they actually have. A pause. Celeste Valenti's investment. Bianca's jaw tightened. She's clean. I know she's clean. Do they know she's clean? Patricia's voice had the quality it got when she was moving rapidly through a legal landscape, checking terrain. Bianca, If someone has been researching Celeste in connection with Romano Couture, and they found even a surface-level connection to Di Lorenzo family finances, even an old one, even one that's been severed and documented, they can construct a narrative. It doesn't have to be true to be damaging. Bianca thought about the email Mira had found. Daniel's message to Voss, detailed, specific, Celeste's name in it. She thought about what Cassian had said. He's specifically been tracking Celeste. They'd had Celeste's name for months. They'd had time to research, and whatever they'd found or constructed, they'd built it into something Caruso felt confident enough to deploy in a phone call. "I need to see Celeste," she said. "Today." "I'll make some calls," Patricia said. "Caruso's name, I know it. He's done work in financial litigation, corporate disputes. He's not Mafia adjacent in the obvious way." A pause. "Which means whoever retained him is trying to look legitimate." Luca was trying to look legitimate. Of course he was. She called Celeste from the car. The older woman answered immediately, as if she'd been holding the phone. "Something's happened," she said before Bianca spoke. "Why do you say that?" "Because I received a visitor this morning." Celeste's voice was steady but compressed in a way Bianca hadn't heard before. "A man named Voss. He came to the building. The doorman let him up because he said he had a delivery for me. Personal, requiring signature. He didn't have a delivery. He had an envelope." "What was in it?" "Photographs," Celeste said. "Financial documents and a letter." A pause. The letter was from Luca. Bianca closed her eyes, opened them. The car moved through Saturday Brooklyn traffic, slow and ordinary, completely indifferent. What did it say? Celeste read it. She read it in the flat, precise way of someone who has already processed the shock and is now in the territory beyond it. The letter said, in the measured language of a man who'd had it written by someone who knew what they were doing, that Celeste's investment in Romano Couture constituted a violation of the terms of a private family agreement established at the time of her estrangement, that the funds she had deployed could be traced in origin to De Lorenzo family holdings she had no legal right to independently invest, and that he was prepared to bring this to the attention of relevant financial authorities unless she was willing to discuss an arrangement. It was a threat. Dressed in legal language, but stripped down to its structure, it was a simple threat. "Is it true?" Bianca said. "The funds?" "No," Celeste said. "The investment came from my personal holdings, built over 30 years independently. The claim is fabricated." "Can you prove that?" "Yes. But it would require disclosing financial records I've kept private for reasons that have nothing to do with illegality and everything to do with privacy." A pause. "And the disclosure process would take time. Weeks, possibly months, depending on how aggressively they push. And in that time, the claim exists publicly, or semi-publicly. Enough to create questions about Romano Couture's capital structure, enough to make your clients and partners nervous, enough to..." Celeste stopped. "Enough to do what they couldn't do by competing with us," Bianca said. "Yes." The car stopped at a light. A woman crossed in front of it, pushing a stroller, unhurried, the particular entitlement of someone who has the right of way and knows it. Bianca watched her. "Celeste," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Did Luca know? Before any of this started? Before Daniel? Before Voss? Did he know you were invested in Romano Couture?" The pause was a beat too long. "Celeste." "I don't know," she said. "I believed he didn't. But the letter he sent, the level of specificity about the investment structure, he either investigated and found it, or he knew before and waited." "How long could he have known?" "I don't..." She stopped again. 3 years ago. There was a situation with an attorney who handled some of my estate planning who later went to work for a firm with De Lorenzo connections. At the time, I didn't consider it a breach. Now, 3 years. Luca had potentially known for 3 years that his estranged mother was funding his ex-wife's company, had known and waited, had watched and constructed and been patient in the way that men who have lost most of their power become patient, the way a damaged predator learns to wait because it can no longer afford to run. He hadn't been standing on that Paris sidewalk because he was uncertain about whether Bianca was real. He'd been standing there because he already knew what he was going to do, and he was deciding when. She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not quite. The specific temperature drop that comes when you understand that you have been outmaneuvered in the place you felt most certain, and that the timeline you believed you controlled has been running alongside a different timeline you couldn't see. She got to Celeste's building in 20 minutes. Celeste met her at the elevator in the sitting room. The envelope was on the coffee table, its contents spread in a careful arrangement. Photographs first, then the financial documents, then the letter on top. Celeste had clearly organized them after reading them, the instinct of someone who processes crisis by imposing order on its materials. She looked smaller than she had at their last meeting. Not diminished, exactly, but compressed. The way people look when they've been carrying something heavy for several hours and the weight has become visible. Bianca sat. She read the letter. She read the documents. She looked at the photographs. Several of them showed Celeste entering and leaving the Romano Couture atelier in Greenpoint over a period, date-stamped, surveillance-quality images that had required someone with resources and patience to produce. "He's had someone watching the building," she said. "Yes," Celeste said. "That's what I believe." "For how long?" "The earliest date stamp on those photographs is 22 months ago." 22 months. While the false financial package was being constructed. While Daniel Reeves was forwarding quarterly projections to Voss. While Bianca's sons were doing their calculations, and Patricia Hess was building her legal case, and Bianca herself was choosing May for a birthday party that was supposed to be the moment of her choosing. All of it had been running alongside this. Her phone rang. It was Cassian. She answered. "We have a problem," he said, and his voice had the quality it almost never had, stripped of the analytical distance, raw in the way that means the analysis has already happened and the outcome is bad. "Tell me." Orion found something in the false financial package. After it was sent. A pause. "Mom, whoever received it, they didn't just forward it. They sent it to a forensic financial analyst, within 48 hours of Daniel transmitting it. Someone on the other end of this is sophisticated enough to have it reviewed before they act on it. And the analyst flagged it. Orion found the flag in a secondary email chain Mira pulled. Daniel's been communicating on 2 channels, not 1. The second channel goes somewhere different from Voss." He paused. "Somewhere that has a forensic analyst on retainer." "Luca's had legitimate financial advisors for years," she said. "This isn't his financial advisor," Cassian said. Orion traced the analyst's name. "He works for a law firm. The law firm does financial litigation." A beat. "Bianca, the law firm is Caruso's firm." She was quiet. "They already knew the package was false when Caruso called you," Cassian said. "The call wasn't a negotiation opener, it was a test. He wanted to see how you'd react when you found out they knew." She sat with that for a moment. She sat with the specific sensation of a structure you've built carefully, revealing the assumption it was built on. The assumption that the other side was reactive, was chasing, was one step behind. The assumption that she'd been setting the tempo. "How much does Orion say this compromises us?" she said. "The false package itself doesn't compromise us. It's a document, not an action. But if they can demonstrate that we knew about Daniel's communications and chose to manipulate them rather than reporting them through proper channels, it creates a legal exposure." Another pause. "Patricia would know better than I do." "I'll call her," Bianca said. "Cassian." "There's more." She waited. "The second email chain, the one that doesn't go to Voss." He took a breath. "It goes to Vanessa." Bianca's hand tightened on the phone. "Vanessa Cross has been coordinating this," Cassian said. "Not Luca, not Morano. Vanessa." His voice had something in it now that she'd only heard a few times in his life. A quality between fury and something colder than fury. The place beyond the point where language catches what's actually happening internally. "She's the one with the financial analyst. She's the one who retained Caruso." Mira pulled a transfer record from one of the secondary accounts. The payments to Voss have been coming from an entity that traces back to Vanessa Cross's personal holdings. In the sitting room, Celeste had gone very still on the chair across from Bianca, watching her face. Vanessa. Not Luca as the architect. Vanessa, who'd stood beside him at the gala with a practiced smile, while his wife stood 20 feet away in champagne silk with her hand on her stomach. Vanessa, who had apparently spent 14 years doing what women who choose to live adjacent to powerful men learn to do. Watching, absorbing, building leverage. "Where's Luca in this?" Bianca said. "I don't know," Cassian said. "I don't know if he's directing her or if she's running this independently." She'd need his cooperation for the legal threat around Celeste's investment. Unless she has documentation she can use without him. Which meant either Luca and Vanessa were operating in concert, which would make them a single coordinated threat, or Vanessa was running her own operation using Luca's name and the De Lorenzo history as the instrument, which would make the situation both more complicated and potentially more unstable. "Find out," she said. "I need to know if they're together on this or if she's acting alone." She hung up. She looked at Celeste. "Vanessa Cross," she said. Celeste's expression moved through something. "She's always been intelligent," she said. "I said that once to Luca years ago, when he first brought her into his life publicly. I said she's intelligent, which is different from trustworthy, and that he should think carefully about the difference." She paused. He didn't listen. Men rarely do when the point is about a woman they want. "The letter," Bianca said. "Was it in Luca's language? His phrasing?" Celeste looked at it, looked back at Bianca. "No," she said slowly. "It's in his name. But the construction—" She picked it up, read a section. "No. Luca's threatening language is direct, blunt. He doesn't embed it in legal framing. This is someone else's voice. Vanessa wrote it, or had it written. Either way, the threat against Celeste had come from Vanessa's operation, using Luca's name as the weight behind it, which meant one of two things. Luca knew and had sanctioned it, which made them coordinated, or Luca didn't know his name was being deployed, which made him a tool in someone else's hands, and Vanessa considerably more dangerous than Bianca had accounted for. She called Patricia. She told her everything. The Caruso call, the letter to Celeste, the forensic analyst, Vanessa's apparent role. Patricia listened in total silence, which was not her normal mode, and that silence told Bianca the situation was as bad as it felt. "The false financial package," Patricia said when Bianca finished. "You need to document that it was a deliberate counterintelligence measure taken after discovering an active corporate espionage operation. I need a full timeline. When the breach was discovered, what steps were taken, what the intent of the false document was. If that documentation exists and is solid, the legal exposure is manageable. And the threat against Celeste? Celeste needs to start disclosure of her financial records immediately. Every day of delay is a day that narrative exists unchallenged." Patricia's voice was tight and controlled. "I also want to know everything Orion found in those secondary email chains, not summaries, raw data. I'll have him send it. Bianca." Patricia stopped. A moment. "The timeline you've been working toward, May." "Yes." "This changes the shape of it. Not necessarily whether it's possible, but the sequence. If they know we've been building a legal case, and if Vanessa is sophisticated enough to have retained Caruso and a forensic analyst, she's sophisticated enough to suspect we have, then we can't wait until May," Bianca said. "I don't know that. What I know is that we cannot afford another move they see coming." She sat in Celeste's sitting room after the call ended, and she let herself feel, for 60 seconds, the full weight of the thing. She gave herself the 60 seconds the way you give yourself the 60 seconds before you have to stand up and keep moving. She felt the specific exhaustion of having run a 14-year project with everything she had, and discovering that the ground it was built on had a different map than the one she'd been using. She felt something that was not quite despair and not quite rage, but lived in the geography between them, a compound emotion with no clean name. Then she stood up. "I need to use your study," she said to Celeste. "Of course. And I need you to call your own attorney today, not Monday. Today." Celeste nodded once. "Already planned." Bianca went into the study. A room lined with books and the quiet smell of old paper, a desk that had the worn surface of something actually used, and she called Kyle. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "Talk," he said. "The Milan proposal," she said. "The architectural installation you wanted." "Yes." "Expand it. Make it as large as you were thinking and then larger. I want it to be the most significant thing we've proposed in 10 years. I want it to look like a company betting everything on visibility." A pause. "I thought the timing changed," she said. "They're waiting for us to be cautious. We're going to be the opposite of cautious." She could hear Kyle processing this. "How long do I have?" "3 days. Mom, Kyle." A breath. "Okay. And I need you to call someone for me," she said. "The journalist, the one who did the first major profile of the Murray shop." "Isabelle Laurent." "Yes. I want her to know that Romano Couture is about to make an announcement. I want her interested before the announcement happens. I want there to be eyes on us from a direction that isn't ours." Kale was quiet for a moment. "You want the visibility to be real," he said, "not just the proposal." "I want the next move to be public," she said, "which means it's harder to attack quietly." She hung up. She sat at Celeste's desk. Outside the study window, the Upper East Side moved through its Saturday in the unhurried way of neighborhoods that have had money long enough to have forgotten being without it. A horse-drawn carriage moving through the park at the edge of her sight line. The geometry of buildings against a gray sky. She thought about Vanessa Cross. She thought about a woman who'd chosen Luca Di Lorenzo and then apparently chosen not to be dependent on him. Who'd built something of her own using the position he'd given her and the access that came with it. Who was smart enough to retain a forensic analyst before acting on data and careful enough to run 2 communication channels simultaneously. Who had written a threatening letter to a 70-year-old woman using a man's name as the instrument because she understood that the name still carried weight, even as the man behind it was crumbling. There was a version of this story, Bianca thought, where Vanessa Cross was not the villain, where she was a woman who'd made her own calculations and was executing them with her own particular kind of intelligence. That version didn't change anything about what needed to happen next, but it sat in Bianca's mind with a weight she acknowledged and did not discard. Her phone buzzed. A message from Orion. "Found something. Need to show you in person. How soon can you be home?" She wrote back. 1 hour. She stood. She went back to the sitting room where Celeste was on the phone with her attorney, back straight, speaking in the compressed, precise way that people speak when they are managing a crisis without performing one. Celeste looked up. Bianca held up one finger. A minute, and waited. When Celeste hung up, she said, "My attorney wants everything in the envelope photographed and sent to him by this evening." "Good," Bianca said. "Celeste, are you all right?" Celeste looked at her with those eyes that had, from the beginning, carried something Bianca could identify as kinship, even when she'd resisted identifying it that way. "I'm 70 years old," she said. "I've been managed by men my entire adult life. I'm not frightened of this." "Good," Bianca said again. "Are you?" Bianca thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'm angry. That's different." Celeste's expression moved toward something. "Good," she said, and the word carried a dry, fierce weight that Bianca felt in her chest. She left. Orion was at the kitchen table when she arrived home, and what was on the table in front of him was not the laptop or the handwritten pages of calculations. It was a printed document, a single printed sheet, face down, and he was sitting with his hands flat on the table on either side of it in a posture she didn't recognize, a posture that meant his body had preceded his brain to some conclusion and was waiting for the rest of him to arrive. "Orion," she said. He turned the page over. It was a corporate filing. Recent. Dated 8 weeks ago. A registration document for a holding entity in Delaware, which was unremarkable. What was remarkable was the named director. Not Vanessa Cross. Not Carlo Morano. Not Frank Caruso. The named director of the holding entity that controlled the shell company that had been funding the entire operation. The payments to Voss, the retainer for Caruso, the forensic analyst, all of it. was a name Bianca had not seen in 14 years, a name she'd removed deliberately from every part of her life. Luca Alessandro De Lorenzo. He'd been running it himself. He'd been running all of it himself. Vanessa had been the face, the retained attorney, the analyst, the visible operation. But the money, the corporate structure, the legal instrument, all of it was Luca's. Which meant he hadn't been standing on a Paris sidewalk 3 years ago trying to decide whether she was real. He'd been standing there because he was already 3 years into a construction project aimed directly at what she'd built. And Vanessa's role, Bianca looked at the document and felt the shape of it arrive with a cold, specific clarity. Vanessa's role was not to protect Luca's interests. Vanessa's role was to take the fall if it went wrong. He'd built an operation with a woman as the visible director, the face, the legal contact, the name on the communications, so that if anyone came looking, they'd find Vanessa. He'd protected himself by making her the target. 14 years with that man. Vanessa Cross had spent 14 years beside Luca De Lorenzo, and he'd structured his attack on his ex-wife in a way that put Vanessa's name between himself and the consequences. Bianca stood in the kitchen with the document in her hand, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt sorry for Vanessa Cross. Not enough to stop, not enough to change what was coming. But the feeling was there, specific and real, and she let it exist because pretending it wasn't there would have been a lie, and she was done with lies in her own house. "Mom," Orion said. His voice had no inflection. "What do we do?" She set the document down. She looked at her son, this boy who'd fought his way to 4 pounds in a NICU, who'd become the person in this family who saw numbers as a language and used it with a clarity that still occasionally astonished her. This person who was sitting with his hands flat on a table because he'd arrived somewhere difficult and was waiting for her to arrive with him. "We changed the plan," she said. "How much?" "All of it," she said. "We were going to show him everything at once. May, the ballroom, all of it arriving at the same moment." She picked up the document again. "That's not enough now. He needs to understand what's happening before he walks into that room. He needs to have already lost before he arrives." Orion watched her. "I want him to know," she said. "I want him to see it coming and not be able to stop it. That's worse than surprise. Surprise is over in a moment. Watching it arrive is something else entirely." She set the document face down on the table. She looked at the window. She looked at the gray October sky visible through the glass, and she thought about May and about a ballroom and about 3 sons walking through a door. "Call your brothers," she said. "Tonight. All of us." Orion reached for his phone. "And Orion," she said. He looked up. "Find out," she said, "exactly how much Luca De Lorenzo is worth right now. Not the number he wants people to believe, the real number." Orion held her gaze. "And then?" "And then," she said, "we figure out how to own it." Orion's number came back in 72 hours. He presented it on a Wednesday evening with all 3 brothers at the kitchen table and Bianca at the head of it, the way they'd been doing serious things for years. Food on the table first, the ritual of it, then the thing itself. He laid out 3 printed pages and a laptop turned so everyone could see the screen, and he walked them through it in the careful, uninflected way he delivered things that mattered. The way that meant he'd already processed his reaction and set it aside so the information could be received cleanly. Luca De Lorenzo's real net worth, stripped of inflated valuations and creative accounting and the particular financial theater of a man performing solvency he no longer had, was approximately 40% of what his public profile suggested. The criminal infrastructure was gone, seized, collapsed, or abandoned over the past decade as his organization shed lieutenants to federal investigations and rival consolidation. What remained was a cluster of legitimate businesses: 2 commercial real estate holdings in New Jersey, a distribution company, a mid-tier hospitality group with 3 hotel properties, and a financial services entity that had been restructured twice in the past 4 years in ways that suggested someone trying to move assets into defensible positions. "The hospitality group," Orion said, tapping the screen. "2 of the 3 properties were capitalized during the marriage. I cross-referenced the incorporation dates against the asset disclosure Patricia filed 6 years ago. Patricia had been on the phone earlier that day. Her voice when she called had a quality Bianca associated with lawyers who have found the thing they've been looking for. Controlled excitement, the professional equivalent of a held breath. The Ridgeline Hotel in Bergen County, Patricia had said, incorporated 11 months after the wedding. The capital injection came from a joint account. He restructured it into a personal holding entity 3 years before the gala, but the original capitalization is documented. Can we move on it? Bianca had said. We've been able to move on it for 2 years, Patricia said. I was waiting for your signal. She'd given the signal. Now she looked at her sons around the table and she said, Patricia files Friday. The legal action will be public record by Monday morning. Cassian had his hands flat on the table. And the birthday party is in 11 days, she said. Celeste sent the invitations in December. Luke has been invited. He confirmed. He confirmed before any of this happened, Kael said. Yes. Will he still come? She thought about that. She thought about a man who'd spent 3 years constructing an operation designed to use her company as leverage, who'd structured it with Vanessa as the visible instrument and himself as the protected core, who'd stood on a Paris sidewalk in the belief that watching was the same as controlling. He'll come, she said, because not coming is the same as admitting he lost. And Luca De Lorenzo has never once, in the time I knew him, been able to admit that. The table was quiet. There's something else, Orion said. He looked at his screen. I've been tracking the secondary email chain, Vanessa's chain. There's been no traffic on it in 6 days. Since when? Cassian said. Since the day after I found the Delaware filing. Orion looked up. I think she knows we found it, and I think... He paused, choosing the word with the precision he always brought to things that weren't numbers. I think she's deciding something. About Luca, Kael said. About whether to keep being his instrument, Orion said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Bianca stood up and started clearing plates, because her hands needed something to do, and because this was what she did. She moved, she worked, she let her body carry the weight while her mind stayed clear. We proceed, she said. Whatever Vanessa decides is her decision. We don't adjust for it. What if she comes to us? Cassian said. Bianca turned from the sink. Then we listen, she said. And we don't trust anything we haven't verified independently. Kael was looking at her with the expression he had when he was building something in his mind, arranging structure. The ballroom, he said. You said you want him to see it coming, to watch it arrive. Yes. Then he needs to know before the party what the legal action contains. Not after. Not when Patricia files on Monday and he has his attorneys call hers and they begin the process. He needs to know what we've actually taken. Kael leaned forward. I want to be the one who tells him. Bianca looked at her eldest son. Not by phone, Kael said. In person. I want him to look at me. The silence at the table had a particular quality to it, the quality of something being decided that can't be undecided. No, Cassian said. Kael looked at him. Not you alone, Cassian said. All 3 of us. Kael held his brother's eyes for a moment, then he nodded. Once. Bianca set down the dish she was holding. Where? His office, Cassian said. The real estate company on Park. It's the only address in the filings that looks like he actually uses it. He'll have security. We're not going to threaten him, Cassian said. We're going to walk in and introduce ourselves. He said it with the flat precision of someone who has identified the exact instrument the situation requires. His security can't stop that. She looked at her 3 sons. She looked at Kael, 26 years old now, 6 feet, with her own jaw and Luca's eyes, and the particular physical authority of someone who spent a decade learning to take up space intentionally. She looked at Cassian, 26, compact and still in the way of someone whose power is entirely interior, who could make a room feel watched without moving. She looked at Orion, 26, the 3 pounds 1 ounce that had terrified her now expressed as something lean and precise and utterly present. She had made these people. They had made themselves. She didn't know exactly where one ended and the other began, and she had long since decided that was the right kind of not knowing. Thursday, she said. Before the filing. Yes, Cassian said. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, a hard November sky over a city that was moving with the particular urgency of people who've stopped pretending the weather is temporary. Bianca was in the atelier at 6, working, a commission piece, the kind of focused handwork that had been her anchor for 14 years, the thing that was true regardless of what else was happening. She worked for 2 hours. Her hands were steady. She noted that and was grateful for it. The boys left at 9:15. She knew the office building from the filings, a tower on Park in the 50s, the kind of address that announces a particular aspiration toward legitimacy. She knew Luca maintained an office there for the real estate entity. She knew from Orion's research that he was there most Thursday mornings. She did not go with them. She had considered it and decided against it because this particular act, her sons walking through that door, announcing themselves to the man who had discarded them before they were born, belonged to them and not to her. She had carried it for 26 years. It was theirs now. She worked. She kept her phone on the table beside her and she worked, and at 10:40 it rang. Kael. "We're in," he said. His voice was steady. Underneath the steadiness, at a frequency she could identify because she'd been reading his voice since before he had language, something that wasn't quite adrenaline and wasn't quite grief and was possibly both. "Tell me," she said. "He was in a meeting. His assistant tried to turn us away. Cassian told her our names." A pause. She went in. He came out. She could hear Cassian's voice in the background, low, and Orion's, and then a silence. "He looked at us," Kael said. "For about 10 seconds he just looked at us. And? He knew." Another pause. "He didn't say that. He didn't say anything for a long time. But he knew. Mom, he knew who we were the second he saw us." She pressed her free hand flat against the work table. "He took us into the office," Kael said, "closed the door, and Cassian told him." "Told him what exactly?" "Everything," Kael said. "The legal filing, the Ridgeline property, the Bergen County holding, Patricia's documentation going back 14 years, all of it. Cassian laid it out in about 4 minutes, and then he stopped, and he waited." "What did Luca say?" A longer pause. "He said," Kael said slowly, "How much does she know?" Bianca was very still. Cassian said, "She knows everything." And then Luca said, Kael stopped. She could hear him breathing. He said, "Is she well?" The atelier was quiet. The city outside moved. Somewhere above her, a pipe knocked against something in the old building, the ordinary mechanical complaint of a structure that's been standing for decades. "That's what he said?" she said. "That's what he said." She didn't know what to do with that. She noted the fact of not knowing and set it aside. "Come home," she said. "There's one more thing," Kael said. "When we were leaving, he stopped Orion." A pause. He asked him what he does. Orion told him, and Luca said, another pause, shorter. He said, "You have her instincts." Orion didn't say anything. He just walked out. She closed her eyes, opened them. "Come home," she said again. They came home. They were quieter than she'd expected, all three of them, the specific quiet of people who've gone to a place they've been imagining for a long time, and returned with the knowledge that imagined places and real places are never the same shape. They ate lunch at the kitchen table without a lot of conversation, and then Kael went to the atelier to work, and Orion went to his room, and Cassian sat across from her and said, "You should have come." "No," she said. "He asked about you." "I know. He wanted to know if you're well." Cassian's jaw was set. "Like we were a status update. Like we were—" He stopped. "Cassian." "I'm fine," he said, which was not true but was what he needed to say. "What you did this morning," she said, "is the bravest thing I've ever watched anyone do." He looked at her. His eyes were Luca's color, too. All three of them, that same specific shade she'd spent 8 years looking across a table at. But everything behind them was his own, was entirely and completely his. "It didn't feel brave, Yem," he said. "It felt like closing a door." "Yes," she said. "It did." Friday, Patricia filed. By Monday morning, it was public record, and by Monday afternoon, the calls had started. Journalists, industry contacts, two of Romano Couture's major partners calling to ask carefully what this meant for operational continuity. Bianca's communications team, led by a woman named Grace Kim, who'd been with the company for 7 years and who handled crisis the way surgeons handle bleeding, efficiently, without commentary on the nature of the wound, issued a single statement that acknowledged the legal proceeding, described it as a long-standing civil matter related to pre-existing marital asset claims, and emphasized that Romano Coutre's operations, financial position, and client relationships were entirely unaffected. The statement worked because it was true. The legal action was about what Luca had taken, not about what Bianca had built. The distinction mattered. Luca's attorneys called Patricia on Tuesday. Patricia called Bianca. "They want to negotiate," she said. "No," Bianca said. "They're offering a settlement figure." "No." "Bianca, the settlement figure is—" "I don't care what the figure is," she said. "This goes through the courts, publicly, everything on record." A pause. "That will take longer." "I know." "He'll fight it." "I know," she said. "Let him." She could hear Patricia processing this. "The birthday party is Saturday," Patricia said. "Yes." "And you still intend to, yes." "Bianca." Patricia's voice had something in it that was not quite legal counsel and not quite anything else, the tone that surfaces when a professional relationship has lasted long enough to become something harder to categorize. "Are you sure about the party?" "More than anything else in this entire plan," Bianca said. "Yes." Wednesday, she received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "This is Vanessa Cross," said the voice. Bianca sat down. Vanessa's voice was lower than she'd expected. Controlled. Not the voice of someone performing calm, but the voice of someone who has been calm through difficult things long enough that it's become structural. "I'm not calling on behalf of Luca," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "All right," Bianca said. "I'm calling because I think you should know something, before Saturday." A pause. "Luca doesn't know I'm calling." "What do you want to tell me?" "He's not going to fight the legal action," Vanessa said. "Whatever his attorneys say publicly, he's already decided to let it proceed without a real defense." A pause. "Because fighting it means discovery, and discovery means things come out that he—" She stopped. "He has more exposure than what your attorney has found. Things that aren't in the marital asset filings." Bianca was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" A silence. Long enough that Bianca wondered if the call had dropped. "Because I spent 14 years being the woman he chose over you," Vanessa said finally. "And I want you to know that I understand now what that cost. What he costs." Another pause. "And because he put my name on documents he had no right to put my name on. And I would rather you know the full shape of what he is than discover it incrementally." "The Delaware entity," Bianca said. "Yes." "You didn't know?" "Not until 4 months ago." Vanessa's voice had something in it now. Not quite anger, the thing that lives on the other side of anger when it's been fully metabolized. "I thought I was a partner in this. I was a shield." Bianca looked at the atelier wall, the thread rack, the standing frame with the half-finished commission piece, the pressed tin ceiling above it. She thought about what Cassian had said. It felt like closing a door. She thought about Celeste saying, "I'm not frightened of this." She thought about a hotel notepad and a short pencil and 3 names in 1 word. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to stop," Vanessa said. "I'm going to remove myself from every instrument he used my name for, which I've already started doing." A beat. "And I'm not going to the party." "All right," Bianca said. "He will," Vanessa said. "He'll go because he won't be able to stop himself. That's what you need to know about Luca. When he doesn't know what else to do, he goes toward the thing he's lost. He always has." The call ended. Bianca sat for a long time. Then she stood, and she went to her work table, and she picked up the piece she'd been working for the past 3 weeks. The commission for the hotel, the large-scale embroidered panel that was almost finished now, maybe 6 hours from completion. She threaded the needle. She found her place in the pattern. She worked through the afternoon. She worked while the light changed and the atelier got dark, and she switched on the work lamp. And she thought about Saturday and about a ballroom she hadn't been inside in 15 years and about the 3 men who were going to walk into it with her. She finished the panel at 11 that night. She stepped back from it and looked at it in the work lamp's circle of light. 12 weeks of work, hundreds of hours of precise physical labor, a pattern that expanded from its center point in a series of interlocking geometric forms that grew larger and more complex as they moved outward. Her grandmother's pattern, adapted and expanded and made into something that was entirely her own. She photographed it. She sent the photograph to Kyle with no message. He replied in 3 minutes. "It's the best thing you've ever made." She turned off the light. She locked the atelier. She went upstairs. Saturday came cold and clear, the kind of November day that has no ambiguity about it. Bright sky, hard light, air that cuts. She dressed deliberately. Not the way she'd dressed for the gala 15 years ago. The champagne silk, the care taken for an occasion that turned out to be something else. She dressed for herself, in the specific and considered way she'd learned to dress in the years since, which was the way of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and requires no external validation of it. Black. Clean lines. The kind of elegant severity that her grandmother would have recognized and approved. The only embellishment a narrow cuff on the left sleeve, hand-worked in gold thread, a detail no one would notice from across a room, and that meant everything to her precisely because of that. Her sons came to the atelier at 4. They were dressed similarly, not coordinated, nothing theatrical, but with the same quality of deliberateness. Kyle in a dark suit that he'd tailored himself, Cassian in charcoal, precise, Orion in navy, the pencil he always carried tucked into his breast pocket because he was constitutionally incapable of being without it. She looked at them. She thought about a hospital room and 3 small beds and a velvet curtain the color of shelter. She thought about a kitchen table in a logistics meeting and a forensic analyst and a Delaware filing. She thought about a man standing on a Paris sidewalk deciding whether to go in. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," said Cassian. "Yes," said Orion. Kyle didn't say anything. He held out his arm. She took it. The car drove uptown through the clear November dark, the city doing its Saturday evening thing around them. Lights, movement, the ambient sound of 8 million people in motion. Nobody talked much. Cassian looked out the window. Orion had his pencil in his hand and was turning it through his fingers. The motion so habitual, he probably didn't know he was doing it. Kyle sat straight beside her, his arm still under her hand. The building appeared ahead. The same stone facade, the same iron gate, open now, with a pair of men from the catering company moving equipment through it. The same driveway. The same windows, lit from inside, the light of chandeliers visible through the tall glass, warm and extravagant and entirely unconcerned with the history of anyone standing outside it. She felt her pulse, noted it, steady. The car stopped. The door opened. She stepped out onto the driveway and the cold air found her face, and for one fraction of a second she was standing in November rain in a champagne gown with her hand on her stomach, and everything ahead of her was dark and unbuilt and enormous. One fraction of a second. Then it was gone. She stood in the clear November night outside the De Lorenzo mansion, 15 years older, and in possession of everything she'd built since she'd last stood here, and her 3 sons came to stand beside her, Kyle on her left, Cassian and Orion behind, and together they walked toward the door. Inside, behind the tall windows, the chandeliers were still burning, and somewhere in that ballroom, she knew, a man who had once sent his pregnant wife into the rain was standing with a glass in his hand and the specific expression of someone who does not yet know that the thing they've been dreading has already arrived, is already on the driveway, is already. The door opened and the warmth hit her first. Warmth and light, and the sound of 100 conversations layered over a string quartet playing something she didn't recognize, the specific acoustic texture of a large room full of people who've been drinking long enough to have gotten comfortable. A woman from the event staff took their coats. Bianca felt the cold leave her shoulders, and what replaced it was nothing, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the need for protection. She walked in. The ballroom was the same. 15 years, and it was the same. The same chandeliers, the same gold-veined marble underfoot, the same tall windows that had held the light of that gala like a painting she'd been standing inside. The flowers were different, white and pale green for Celeste's birthday, where they'd been gardenia and ivory before, and the crowd was different in composition, if not in category. Older money, less criminal, the kind of gathering that happens when a woman of genuine stature turns 70, and the people who show up are people who've earned the right to be there, rather than people who've been required to attend. But the bones of the room were the same. She felt Kael's arm under her hand, and she held it, and she kept walking. They were noticed. Not immediately. They entered through the main door with the other late arrivals, and for 30 seconds they were simply 4 people in a ballroom. But the noticing began at the edges and moved inward, the way a shift in air pressure moves through a room before anyone names it. She could feel it happening. She'd attended enough of these events, in this world and in the legitimate world that had grown up around Romano culture, to know the texture of a room paying attention. Celeste found them first. She came through the crowd with the directness of someone who has been watching the door, wearing a gown the color of gunmetal that made her look exactly as formidable as she was. She stopped in front of Bianca, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. 2 women who'd built something unusual and specific and difficult over 11 years, standing on the ground where it had been necessary to build it. Celeste took Bianca's hands. "You came," she said. "You invited us," Bianca said. Celeste's eyes moved to the boys. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they've been aware of for a long time, but have never been allowed to stand close to. Her expression was controlled, but not quite entirely controlled. At the edges of it, something lived that was harder to manage than composure. "I know who you are," she said to them. "I've known for a long time." She looked at Kael, then Cassian, then Orion. "I wasn't sure you knew about me." "We found out 4 years ago," Kael said. "Mom told us." Celeste looked at Bianca. "They had the right to know," Bianca said simply. Celeste squeezed her hands once and released them. "He's here," she said. Her voice had dropped, not from fear, but from the particular register of things said carefully. "He arrived 40 minutes ago. He's at the far end of the room near the east windows." "Is he alone?" Cassian said. "He came with an attorney," Celeste said. "Not Caruso, someone else, and a man I don't know." She paused. "He looks—" She stopped again. "Tell me," Bianca said. "He looks like he knows why he's here," Celeste said. "Not the birthday. The other reason." Bianca nodded. "He's been watching the door since he arrived," Celeste said. She'd known he would be. She'd known since Vanessa's call. When he doesn't know what else to do, he goes toward the thing he's lost. That Luca would be standing in this room waiting for her. The question had never been whether he'd come. The question was what happened when he saw her, and specifically when he saw what was walking in beside her. "Go enjoy your party," Bianca said to Celeste. "This is your birthday." Celeste looked at her with those eyes that had always carried the specific quality of someone who sees more than they say. "Be careful," she said. Not a warning about safety. A warning about something else, something more interior. "I know," Bianca said. Celeste moved back into the room. Bianca stood with her sons for a moment, and she didn't look toward the east windows yet. She looked at the room, the people, the light, the flowers, the ordinary human spectacle of a gathering. She let it exist around her. She let herself be in it before she moved through it. "Together," Cassian said, not as a question. "Together," she said. They walked. She didn't look for Luca. She moved through the room naturally, stopping when someone she knew addressed her. Celeste had, over the years, introduced Bianca to her own social world, a world separate from and older than the De Lorenzo criminal adjacency. And there were faces here she recognized from board meetings and charity events, and the kind of long dinners where business is conducted through the medium of apparently not discussing business. She spoke to these people. She introduced her sons. She watched Cassian engage a man she knew to be a commercial real estate attorney in what became, within 60 seconds, a substantive conversation. And she watched Kael find the artistic eye in the room, always possible at these gatherings, and begin the kind of visual dialogue that he'd been conducting his whole life. She watched Orion stand slightly apart and observe everything with the quality he'd had since infancy. The quality of someone for whom a room is a system, and systems contain information if you're patient enough to read them. She saw Luca before he saw her. He was standing near the east windows, as Celeste had said, with a glass he didn't appear to be drinking from, in a dark suit that was good but not as good as it once would have been. The specific register of expensive that is performing at a slightly lower level than its history, the way things look when the budget behind them has contracted, but the habit hasn't. He was 61. He looked it in the way that men who've been powerful look it. Still substantial, still the physical fact of him that had always dominated rooms, but with something underneath it that had shifted, a quality in the way he held himself that was not quite uncertainty and not quite its opposite. His attorney, a man in his 50s with the watchful expression of someone on professional alert, was speaking to him. Luca wasn't listening. He was watching the room. He found her. She saw the moment it happened, the way his attention locked and held, and the brief absolute stillness that followed, the 3 seconds of a man encountering something that reorganizes his understanding of where he is and what is happening. She held his gaze from across the room, 30 feet of ballroom between them, the string quartet and the conversations, and the particular light of 300 candles and 8 chandeliers, all continuing around the fixed point of 2 people looking at each other for the first time in 15 years. Then his eyes moved. They moved to Kael, who was standing 2 feet to her left and who was, even across a ballroom, unmistakably the jaw, the height, the eyes, those eyes, a fact about Luca de Lorenzo made visible in another person's body. She watched it hit him. It was not dramatic. It was not a collapse or a stagger or any of the things that happen in stories about moments of reckoning. It was smaller than that and worse. His face moved through something that lasted maybe 4 seconds and involved a quality she had never, in 8 years of marriage, seen in him. A quality of being exposed at a level he had no defense for, no performance for, no management strategy sufficient to address. His attorney touched his arm. Luca didn't move. She walked toward him. She crossed the 30 feet of ballroom floor at a pace that was not hurried and not slow, and the room around her continued its human business of eating and drinking and talking and not noticing, or noticing privately in the way people at these events do, registering, filing, saying nothing. Her sons came with her. She could feel them behind her and to her sides, the specific gravity of 3 people who are entirely present to a moment. She stopped 6 feet from Luca. His attorney stepped back. The man she didn't know stepped back. The small zone of space that forms around confrontations in social settings formed, and they were inside it. She looked at Luca de Lorenzo. "Bianca," he said. His voice was the same. That was the thing about voices. They don't age the way faces do. They don't shift with the financial trajectory, or the criminal collapse, or the 14 years of consequence. His voice was exactly the same, and it hit her in the place it would always hit her, the place that has nothing to do with what she thought of him and everything to do with the specific neurological fact of 8 years. She let it land. She didn't flinch from it, and she didn't perform indifference to it. She let it be what it was. "These are my sons," she said. "Kael, Cassian, Orion." Luca looked at them. He looked at all 3 of them, moving from face to face, and she watched him do the things she'd known he would do. The involuntary inventory, the recognition that was physical before it was cognitive. He was looking at himself. He was looking at 3 versions of what he'd thrown away before it had a face. "I know," he said. "They came to see me Thursday." "I know," she said. A silence. The string quartet shifted into something slower behind them. "You've done," Luca started. "Don't," she said. Quiet. Not hostile, just precise. "Don't tell me what I've done. You don't have the standing for that." His jaw tightened. She watched him accept this, not with grace, but with the tired recognition of someone who understands the terms he's operating under. "The legal action," he said, "is proceeding," she said. "You know what Patricia's filed. Your attorneys have the documentation. It will take years." "Yes," she said. "It will. Bianca." He said her name with a weight that was different from the first time. Heavier, with something underneath it that she had to identify carefully, because she needed to be accurate about what it was. It was not manipulation. She'd spent 8 years learning the texture of his manipulation, and this was not that. It was something rawer and less strategic. It was, she thought, regret. The specific kind that has had 15 years to become completely useless. What do you want from this? What's mine, she said. What was always mine. What you structured away and thought I'd never find. And then? And then nothing, she said. There's no then. There's no conversation after. You'll lose the Ridgeline property and the Bergen County holding, and when discovery proceeds, you'll lose whatever else Patricia finds, which will be more. You know that. And my sons, he said, and something in the word my caught in the air between them like a splinter. Cassian moved. Not toward Luca. A shift of weight. A realignment. The kind of movement that communicates something without speech. Luca registered it. They're not yours, Cassian said. His voice was the same controlled flatness it always was, but underneath it was something that had been building since Thursday, since a Park Avenue office and 10 seconds of a man looking at his sons and asking how much she knows. You made a choice about that before we were born. That choice stands. Luca looked at Cassian. He looked at him for a long time. You're right, he said finally. I did. The admission sat in the air. Nobody seemed to know what to do with it, including Luca. He looked like a man who'd arrived at a position he'd been avoiding for 15 years and found it exactly as inhabitable as he'd feared. No cover, no strategy sufficient to the terrain. I was wrong, he said, to Bianca, looking at her directly. Not just the gala, everything before it, the years before it. He stopped. That doesn't repair anything. No, she said. It doesn't. I know. She looked at him. She looked at the man who'd proposed to her in Milan and sat in the corner of an obstetrician's office, checking his phone, and stood at the top of his own anniversary gala with another woman on his arm, and she looked at what 15 years had made of him, and she felt nothing convenient, nothing clean. She felt the complexity of someone for whom hatred had never been available as a pure and uncomplicated thing, because the truth about this man was that he was the father of her sons, and that fact was not something she could simplify without lying. She didn't simplify it. I want you to understand something, she said. I'm not here for revenge. I was never here for revenge. She let that land. I'm here because what was mine was taken, and I'm taking it back. That's legal and legitimate, and it's going to happen. But I didn't build what I built in order to destroy you. I built it because my sons needed something to inherit that was worth inheriting. Luca was very still. They've already inherited it, she said. Everything I've built is theirs. Every client, every relationship, every workshop in Paris and Milan, every piece Patricia is going to recover from your holdings, all of it goes to them, not as a gift, as what it is, what they've earned. She looked at Kyle, at Cassian, at Orion. You wanted to know if she's well, she said. She's more than well. She's finished. The last word landed differently than the others, not as an ending, as an arrival. Luca looked at her. She watched something in him that was not quite surrender and not quite acceptance, but was in the same territory. The territory of a man who has arrived at the specific knowledge that there is nothing left to manage, that the room has already been reorganized by forces he cannot reverse. I had them followed, he said, for years. I knew where they were going to school. I knew what they were studying. He said it without defense, flatly. I told myself it was just keeping track. Don't tell me that, Kael said. He said it from beside her, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, something more contained and more permanent. Whatever story you told yourself about that is yours to carry. We don't need to hear it. Luca looked at his eldest son. She watched him look, and she watched the looking cost him something. All right, Luca said. He set his glass down on the windowsill behind him. He straightened. Something passed through his face that she couldn't fully read and wasn't going to try to read, because there are things in people that belong entirely to themselves, and decoding them is not the same as understanding them. Happy birthday to your mother, he said, meaning Celeste. Then he turned and he walked toward the room's main exit, his attorney falling into step beside him, the man she didn't know moving ahead to hold the door. The crowd continued. No one who hadn't been watching would have known anything had happened. Bianca watched him go. She watched until the door closed, and then she turned back to the room. Orion had his pencil in his hand. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone finishing a calculation. He knew, Orion said quietly, about all of it. Longer than we thought. Yes, she said. And he came anyway. Yes. Orion looked at her. Why? She thought about Vanessa's words on the phone. He goes toward the thing he's lost. She thought about a Paris sidewalk and a window and a man who'd stood outside rather than going in. Because some people, she said, can't be near a thing they've destroyed without needing to look at what grew in its place. Orion turned the pencil once, stopped, pocketed it. Okay, he said, and in the word was everything he'd calculated and set down. Celeste found them 20 minutes later near the end of the east windows where Luca had been standing. She'd seen him leave. Bianca could tell from the quality of Celeste's composed expression that she'd watched the whole room more carefully than anyone had known. He's gone, Celeste said. Yes, Bianca said. And? And it's done, Bianca said. Not finished in the legal sense, but done. Celeste looked at the window, at the dark outside it, at the reflection of the chandeliers in the glass. The room doubled and suspended in the November night. She was quiet for a moment. He was a difficult child, she said. Not cruel, not then. Just certain. About everything. In a way I never knew how to correct because it looked so much like confidence. She paused. I did the best I could with him. I've stopped arguing with myself about whether it was good enough. That sounds right, Bianca said. It took a long time to sound right, Celeste said. She looked at Bianca then, directly. The investment, all of it. I want you to know I don't regret it. Not for the return. The return was extraordinary, and we both know that. I don't regret the choice. Neither do I, Bianca said. They stood together for a moment, these two women who'd arrived at each other through the wreckage of the same man and built something neither of them had planned to build. The room moved around them, and the string quartet played, and the night outside the windows was cold and clear and very still. Later, much later, after the cake and the toasts and the long process of a party winding toward its end, Bianca found herself on the mansion's side terrace with a glass of water and the night air on her face. She'd come out for the quiet and found it, the terrace empty, the sounds of the party muffled through the glass doors behind her. She looked up. The sky was the thing it always is over this city, never fully dark, the light pollution giving it a brownish glow, a handful of stars visible at the zenith if you looked directly up and blocked the building lights with your hand. She looked up. She felt the cold on her face and the stone under her feet and the specific quality of a moment that has arrived after a long journey toward it, the quality that is not triumph and not relief, but something that lives underneath both of them, quieter and more permanent. She thought about a hotel notepad, a short pencil, 3 names and 1 word. The door opened behind her. Cassian came out first, then Kael, then Orion, and they arranged themselves around her the way they'd been arranging themselves around her since they were old enough to choose where to stand, without being asked, without discussion, the simple physical fact of being near. Alma called, Kael said. She wants to know if we're coming to Brooklyn after. What did you tell her? I said probably yes, because that's always the answer with Alma. Bianca almost laughed. She did laugh, quietly, the kind of laughter that has nothing performed in it, and comes from somewhere genuine and slightly tired. Patricia called too, Cassian said. She says the response from Luca's attorneys came in tonight. They're not contesting the filing. She absorbed that. She held it for a moment. The thing she'd been building toward for 14 years arriving in the form of a phone call on a party terrace, which was how important things arrived, usually. Not dramatically, just true. That's good, she said. That's very good, Cassian said, and in his careful voice was something that was not quite emotion, but was its immediate neighbor. Orion was looking at the sky. The Ridgeline property, he said. When it transfers, what do we do with it? What do you think? She said. Sell, he said, without hesitation. Take the capital and put it into the Milan expansion, Kael's installation project. It's the right use of it." "I agree," she said. Kael was leaning on the stone railing, looking at the garden below, dark now. The formal garden of the mansion with its hedges and paths, invisible in November. "Do you know what I want?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "I want to go home and make something," he said. "I've been in motion for 2 months. I need to sit at a table and make something with my hands." She looked at her eldest son. She looked at the specific way he said it, not as an escape from what had happened tonight, but as its natural continuation, as the thing that follows a completed act. "Yes," she said, "that's the right instinct." They stood on the terrace for a while without anyone needing to speak. The city moved at its own vast pace around them, indifferent and magnificent, 8 million lives in motion simultaneous with theirs, each one carrying its own weight of history and choice and consequence. She thought about the embroidered panel she'd finished 3 nights ago. The one folded now in tissue and crated for delivery to Milan. 12 weeks of work, hundreds of hours, a pattern that expanded from its center outward in interlocking forms. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen in Palermo and a 9-year-old's hands learning what patience actually required. Not the performed patience of waiting for something to be over, but the structural patience of someone who understands that the thing they're making cannot be rushed without being destroyed. She had not rushed. She had worked and waited and worked and built what needed to be built, and now it was built, and the work that came after it would be different work, not driven by necessity and anger's quiet understudy, but by the things she'd felt in the early mornings in the Red Hook studio when the boys were asleep behind the velvet curtain and her hands were moving in the circle of lamplight, and the piece she was working was going exactly right. The thing that is not ambition and is not contentment, but contains both of them. The thing that is simply the next right motion. Daniel Reeves resigned Monday. The same morning, Patricia's filing went public. He sent an email to the HR director with no explanation, which Mira forwarded to Bianca with a single line. Caruso's firm dropped him as a client last week. Bianca read it, filed it, and didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. The damage had been understood, the countermeasure had been executed, and the situation had resolved in the way that situations resolve when they're no longer useful to the people who created them. She hired his replacement from within, a young woman named Sarah who'd been in logistics for 2 years and who Mira had recommended with the straightforward intensity she brought to all recommendations. Not enthusiasm, just accuracy. Sarah started on a Wednesday and by Friday had reorganized the international shipping schedule in a way that was so obviously better than the previous system that it was briefly unclear why nobody had done it before. Life, Bianca thought. Life is always doing this. Continuing. Patricia, over the next several months, recovered the Ridgeline property and the Bergen County holding in full, along with 2 additional assets that discovery revealed. A commercial property in Hoboken, and a distribution contract whose original capitalization traced back to joint marital funds in the 3rd year of the marriage. The total value, liquidated and deployed as Orion had suggested, funded the Milan expansion and Kael's architectural installation, and left a reserve that Orion promptly and methodically invested in a manner that would have made a financial journalist weep with admiration. Luca De Lorenzo, in the months that followed, did not appear in the public record in any significant way. The criminal investigations that had been dismantling his organization for a decade reached their various conclusions without fanfare. Plea agreements, asset forfeitures, the bureaucratic machinery of consequence completing its work. He was not charged personally. He had always been careful about that. What he was left with, after all of it, was a private life in a city that had largely moved on from the version of him it had once found worth knowing. Vanessa Cross left New York. She moved to a city she'd apparently chosen years before as a contingency. The specific preparation of a practical woman. She sent Bianca a single message, 3 weeks after the party. "I hope you're well. I mean that simply." Bianca read it twice and then replied, "I am. I hope you are too." That was all. It was, she thought, the right amount. Celeste Valenti turned 70 and kept working. She and Bianca continued meeting once a month, sometimes at the Upper East Side apartment, and sometimes at the Greenpoint Atelier, and sometimes at a restaurant in the Marais when business brought them both to Paris. The meetings were frank and direct, and occasionally contentious in the productive way of two people who respect each other enough to disagree without managing each other. They were, Bianca thought, the best business meetings she'd ever had. They were also, though she'd never have named them this way to anyone else, a form of friendship that had grown up in the particular soil of shared history, the kind that takes years to become itself and is unrecognizable at close range until you step back and see what it is. Kael's architectural installation went up in the Milan hotel lobby the following spring. It was 16 feet high and 12 feet wide, and required 3 structural supports and a specially reinforced mounting system that Kael had designed himself, arguing with the hotel's engineers for 2 months with the focused tenacity of someone who'd been arguing for his vision since before he had language for it. The piece was photographed for 4 international design publications and cited in the profile that Isabelle Laurent finally wrote, the one that Bianca had set in motion by calling Kael from Celeste's study and telling him to make it larger. As the moment Romano Couture became something that could not be categorized as merely a textile company any longer. Isabelle Laurent called it an empire. Bianca read that word and she sat with it for a moment. She thought about empire and what it meant, the reach of a thing, the weight of it, the way it shapes the ground it grows on. She thought about whether it was the right word. She thought about 3 bassinets behind a velvet curtain, about $40 in a coat pocket, about a hotel notepad, about thread, gold and burgundy, the first thing she'd asked for when the world as she'd known it ended, the one thing she'd known how to use. She thought about the word her grandmother had said, "They cannot take what you know how to make." She put the article down. She went to her work table. She was in the middle of a new commission, a private client, a collector who'd seen the Milan installation and wanted something for his home, something personal and specific. Not a statement piece, but an intimate one. He described what he wanted in an email that was surprisingly clear about scale and mood, but left the actual image to her. And she'd been carrying it in her head for 2 weeks, seeing it develop in the way she saw everything develop. Slowly, from the inside out, the pattern clarifying itself as she moved toward it. She threaded the needle. She found the linen she'd prepared, the ground fabric for this piece. She found her starting point. She made the first stitch. Outside the atelier window, Brooklyn moved through its afternoon. Delivery trucks, voices in 2 languages, the metal sound of something being loaded or unloaded, the ambient percussion of a neighborhood that has always been about work. She heard it and didn't hear it, the way she heard and didn't hear everything when her hands were moving and the pattern was coming clear. At 5:30, Orion came in through the front door of the atelier with his coat on and his bag over his shoulder and his pencil behind his ear, which meant he'd come directly from wherever he'd been without stopping upstairs, which meant something was on his mind. He stopped when he saw her at the table. "Still at it?" he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea in 10 minutes." He sat at the second work table. He pulled out a notebook and opened it to a page of figures and worked quietly for a while. The 2 of them in the same room in the same silence they'd been sharing since he was old enough to sit still, which had taken a while. Eventually he looked up. "I've been thinking about the Corsetti Commission," he said, "the one we lost in March, the one where they underbid us using Daniel's projections." She kept working. And I think we can get it back," he said. "Not the original commission, that's done. But there's a follow-on project at the same hotel group, a second property opening next year. I've been looking at their procurement timeline. We can bid it clean." He paused. "And this time we'll know what we're worth." She made a stitch. Another. "Put together the analysis," she said. "Show me Thursday." "Thursday," he said, and went back to his notebook. The afternoon light moved through the atelier windows, the way afternoon light moves in rooms where people are working, slant and golden, and not particularly interested in anything except passing. She worked. Orion worked. Upstairs in a few minutes, she'd hear Kael's studio door open and close, and his footsteps on the stairs. Cassian would call from wherever he was, the way he called every evening, not always with something specific to say, but with the habit of contact that he'd developed so early she couldn't date it. They would all be in the same city, in the orbit of the same work, carrying forward the same thing she'd started in a hotel room with $40 and a borrowed pencil on a night when everything was rain. She made the next stitch. The pattern expanded from its center outward, interlocking forms growing larger and more complex as they moved toward the edges of the linen, each one dependent on what came before it, each one making possible what came after. She worked until the light was gone, and she switched on the lamp. She kept working.